Dead Space 2 is the action-packed continuation of the sci-fi horror series that expands on nearly everything that the original did so well. The cosmic horrors encountered by Isaac Clarke, a space engineer who's on a routine mission to repair a mining vessel, have now pursued him to the Sprawl, a space city suspended from the remains of Saturn's moon Titan. This game is often considered to be the peak of the Dead Space series, with an excellent blend of both action and horror elements. And in the time since I did my review of the remake of the first game in the series, I've also started working at a private space company building a space station. And in combination, this seemed like an excellent opportunity to see how well the space engineering elements of Dead Space 2 are presented, and whether or not they can be considered realistic. And as you can see from the timestamp, there were quite a lot of engineering details to discuss here. So if that sounds interesting to you, make yourself comfortable and we'll get started. Now, as I mentioned with the first game in the series, Dead Space 2 contains quite a lot of blood and gore and extreme violence, and also some disturbing content that YouTube probably wouldn't appreciate being shown in its entirety. With that in mind, I've cut out as much of this stuff as I could, but whatever of it is left is included for educational purposes. Now, since I've already done a review of the first Dead Space, or at least the remake, I'm going to avoid repeating myself where possible and follow the same ground rules that we set up in that video. As a brief recap, we are allowing ourselves one miracle exception to the laws of physics in the form of the unified field theory, a long sought-after extension to the laws of physics that could potentially allow the control of gravity in the same way that we control electricity today. However, there's one adjustment to this rule that I'd like to make compared to how it's been implemented in the past. The reason for only allowing a single miracle exception is that, as the rule was originally defined, the goal was to allow superheroes to fit in with the real world, and not have them be completely unbelievable as something that could maybe happen. And applying this rule to a near-future setting of science fiction has a similar motivation. We don't want to expand too far beyond modern technology, otherwise there's not much connection between what is known now and what might be known in the future. And the driving force behind this motivation is the fact that historically, major revisions to the laws of physics don't happen very often. A good example of this would be quantum theory, which only came about within the last 100 years. And before that, classical physics had reigned supreme for several centuries. So my proposed amendment to the rule is to allow for an additional miracle exception for every 500 years or so that we travel into the future. And with Dead Space being set in approximately the 26th century, we can say that it's probably fair to allow them 2 miracle exceptions. And the second one would probably be used to account for stasis technology, which isn't really explained in detail very much in the series. Now, while we're making amendments to the previous review's methodology, I will acknowledge that I kind of went a little bit overboard with the lack of railings and other safety concerns in that game. The reason I included all this, though, is that this is an important part of human factors, or human-centered design, which is essentially designing your system while considering how a human will be interacting with it, rather than exclusively from an electrical or mechanical perspective. So in this review, I've tried to tone down the space OSHA diatribes, but I will occasionally make some notes when it's relevant to space station design, such as when there's important human factors considerations to be made, or when they're not being made. Also, in my previous review, I was also looking at ideal solutions to some of the problems that we encountered, but in this video we'll take more into account the zeitgeist of the Dead Space universe, and all the other factors that are influencing the situations we find ourselves in. As with the previous review, I'm also not going to be talking about the weapons and tools we encounter in this game, which could easily fill its own video, but there are a few notable points to be made about some of the suits that we encounter. So we'll have some limited discussions about those, although actually breaking down the Dead Space suits could also easily fill its own full video. Alright, so now that we finally got all that taken care of, we can finally get started with the review. During the opening sequence, we see a recording of what appears to be a real-time conversation between Isaac and Nicole, while Nicole is already on board the USG Ishimura. Now, if you're any farther away from Earth than about the distance to the moon, you're going to get a noticeable communication delay due to the time required for electromagnetic waves to travel to and from the two people communicating, since the radio waves that you're using for this communication can only travel as fast as the speed of light. And since space is so big, the speed of light isn't fast enough to give you near instantaneous communication much further out than the moon, which already takes 1.3 seconds for light to travel there one way. So the most realistic way that this conversation could be happening in-game is if this was shortly after the Ishimura had left Earth, which kind of makes sense from the conversation itself. However, immediately before this, during the loading sequence, we see what appears to be a display from a computer terminal from Nicole's perspective, where it indicates that the Ishimura is connecting through a communications relay, starting at the Aegis relay net and connecting to an Enceladus relay net. before establishing a connection to Earth in the Eurasian area where Isaac is located. Based on this loading screen, then, it would imply that the Ishimura is already a great distance away from Earth. If this was the case, he would definitely not be able to have a real-time conversation using traditional electromagnetic-based communication systems. Now, there are two other notes in the communications log, which are the mention of reticulating a yen-yen relay net and opening a right parabola. Presumably, these are technical terms related to a technology in the future that could be used to open a wormhole between two locations through which electromagnetic waves could be sent, resulting in effectively instantaneous communication. Compared to the spatial distortion required to operate an LQBR warp drive, this would actually be theoretically simpler, relatively speaking, since you would only need to open a wormhole that's large enough for radio waves to travel through, rather than for a person or spaceship to travel along. Given the other technological capabilities we've seen in this universe, resulting from the mastery of the unified field theory, I don't think we need to count this as something beyond our miracle exception. Right as we start the game, we see that Franco has found Isaac Clarke in the psych ward of some hospital facility. Despite being in a straitjacket, we see that Isaac is still wearing a rig, like we saw in the previous game. Now in that game, a lot of the functionality of the rig was used to inform other coworkers about your status so that they can be aware of how you're doing, as well as providing life support and biomonitoring capabilities. So presumably here, this could perhaps be a medical version of the rig that is designed to monitor patient health and report on their condition to a central database. One chase sequence later, and we see that the doors in this location are still massively overpowered, just like we saw in the Ishimura. Again, though, this could just be to ensure that you're able to fully seal off a room in the event of a hull breach. Right after this chase sequence, there's a small detail here that I'm not sure if it's intentional or just a bug, where shortly after entering this room, there's a cardiac monitor that's beeping, and then shortly after, flatlines. After a short duration, though, the heartbeat starts up again. Between these two clips, I was messing with the display settings, so this might have affected just restarting a game logic loop or something, but if it's intentional, it's a nice subtle Easter egg. Shortly after making our way through the psych ward, we find a hallway with a large amount of computer equipment along the walls. The cable management of these computers could definitely use some work, but it does appear that they are using what appears to be aerospace-grade connectors that you would typically see in high-reliability operations, such as aerospace. We can also see in the ceiling that there are a large number of cable harnesses, some of which are routed together more effectively than others. While the transparent panels are nice so you can get an idea of where cables are located without having to open them up, it's still quite a mess, and this definitely seems like it could have been done much more efficiently. It's nice to see that this and other elevators often have regularly upkept inspection reports, and at least in this instance, these seem to be fairly believable. However, as we'll see later on, I have reason to believe that these safety inspection stickers are a bit misleading. Also in this elevator, we can see what appear to be a number of power outlets, presumably for connecting devices that require AC power. Now, aside from the fact that there are so many of these outlets in the elevator, this isn't necessarily out of place, except that we see two different designs of AC outlets here. Now, the most plausible reasoning for this would be that you would have multiple standards that might perhaps provide 3-phase versus 2-phase power or different voltages. And so you wouldn't want to be able to accidentally connect a device to the wrong power outlet, so you'd have two different standards. There's a pretty common theme throughout this game of overcomplicated mechanisms and machinery to do otherwise somewhat basic tasks, which is why it's somewhat interesting that these wheelchairs still have a pretty similar design to what we see today. And at least in this one regard, they're actually following the motto of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now there's one small editing note I have to make before we get too far into this game, which is that, I guess because of how old this game is, it's pretty difficult to smoothly turn the camera to follow along something I'm trying to look at here. So a lot of time the sweeping motion to follow a pipeline or something like has a weird acceleration curve, and it can be a little bit abrupt. So I wasn't always able to smoothly pan over the thing that I was looking at. Just a heads up, because I know at some point somebody did point out that this can be kind of jarring to watch. So I know it's not perfect, but I did try to do my best to make it smooth where possible. Throughout the game, we encounter quite a few of these crawl space maintenance ducts that at least personally remind me of the Jefferies tubes from Star Trek. The general idea being that you want to have access to some important infrastructure, but for whatever reason you can't put it in a more highly accessible location, such as behind a wall in one of the rooms. Alternatively, the components could be sensitive or dangerous and you don't want them to be so easily accessible that something could damage them, but you also need to be able to get at them for replacement or repair. This crawl space is definitely not an optimal way to do this though, because you are entering a confined space which is hazard enough on its own, such as if you were to get stuck in there for some way or another, or if there was a pocket of toxic or otherwise hazardous gas that you wouldn't be able to quickly escape from. Though with circuitry too, it would be a lot easier to get electrocuted in this situation. Speaking of which, the cable management in here could also use quite a bit of work, as there's lots of hanging cables you could snag on pretty easily. If you really wanted to do something like this, I suppose you could say it would be useful for ventilation, and you could have some sorts of air monitoring or air-cooled systems along the walls of the duct. Eventually we come across a surgery room with a robotic surgery machine, where a patient is suspended in midair using a kinesis system for a surgery robot to operate on. Now for one, we do see that this is labeled as a telekinetic surgical binding, but telekinetic implies that this is some sort of biological capability, and I suspect this is done in a similar manner to everything being called AI now that's just machine learning. On a more technical note, if you're going to be performing surgery on someone, you want to ensure high precision, especially for a robotic system. And so this wave-like motion of the patient body would be highly ineffective for maintaining precision because they're always going to be moving, so you have to compensate for that with the robot. It's possible that the kinesis emitters are simply misaligned or otherwise not functioning properly, so it's oscillating a lot more than it would during normal operations. But the fact that this is a possibility means that it would be another potential point of failure for the surgery system, and you'd probably be better off just laying down on a platform. I suppose perhaps this could be useful for surgeries requiring 360-degree access to the patient, but dang it, Jim, I'm an engineer, not a doctor, so we'll leave it at that. Now, the way Isaac actually acquires the kinesis module here is rather curious. Not necessarily from the fact that he's able to just hack it into his existing equipment, but the fact that he has existing equipment in the first place that would support this. For one, it seems like he already had the kinesis module equipped to his straitjacket, but perhaps we could say that this is just for some medical application or patient therapy, maybe. We also are not removing a kinesis emitter from this machine, and rather we're taking apart from this control box instead, meaning that the emitter must already be present on the suit. I think what's more likely happening here is that this is some sort of power amplifier that Isaac is removing from this power box that's able to power the kinesis module up to the point where it's actually powerful enough to move things around. And perhaps the patient's straitjacket suit version is only powerful enough to move small objects for potentially mobility impaired patients. Shortly after this, we come across what appears to be a surgery room that is designed to have a higher biosafety level. This isn't exactly specified, but we can see that there are a lot of warning symbols, and the room is fully isolated except for one doorway. Biosafety levels are basically how much containment you have of the room, such that if you're working with highly contagious or otherwise dangerous pathogens or other hazardous substances, you need to have a high enough biosafety level to prevent a containment breach. And this might involve systems such as air filtration and negative pressure rooms, such that air is always flowing into the room rather than out. Now, even replaying this game with an engineering background, this sequence still seems a little strange to me. For one, this is apparently supposed to be a sort of tissue laser for surgical incisions. But it does seem a little curious that you're using something that is effectively a welding tool to cut skin on a living human. I suppose you would get the Star Wars lightsaber benefit of cauterizing the incision as it's made. As far as the actual plasma cutter application here, Isaac is effectively supercharging this surgical cutter into a point where it's actually able to discharge plasma bolts. Which I suppose makes sense if you knew the original Schofield Tools plasma cutter so well, you could probably manage to wire something up to produce a similar effect. I also point out that every time I've seen this scene, it also seems a little weird that Isaac is so focused on setting up the plasma cutter to not stop the patient from being attacked, but I think this is more of an example of just quick, critical decision-making in a high-stakes scenario, where basically without a weapon, there's nothing you could do here anyways. Within the intensive care unit waiting room, we can see a picture on the wall of a nice tropical beach with several moons in the sky. We could perhaps say that this is a reference to the Glisa beach that we saw referenced in the Dead Space remake, thus likely located in the Glisa 581 system. This is one of the first few exoplanetary systems that was suspected of being potentially habitable, and as of recording, we know that there's at least 3 planets there, but the number of moons is uncertain. It also seems like apparently this isn't as habitable as it was thought, but if nothing else, this is a neat bit of space history. It's not hard to imagine that the intensive care unit of a hospital is probably going to be a stressful place to be. Adding on to that, the fact that we are located in space means that this is going to be an even more stressful location to be in. So having these nice tropical beach pictures and an actual aquarium would provide at least a little bit of help in regards to stress reduction, which is especially important for people located in isolated and confined environments, such as in space. Thankfully, we can see that there are fire sprinklers located in this hospital facility. However, they are not deploying in spite of a fire being present right underneath the sprinkler, and they don't actually end up activating until we walk close enough for a jump scare. Which I would almost say is the exact opposite of proper functionality for a fire extinguisher. Throughout the game, we can see a number of advertisements for some sort of pharmaceutical products. Now, obviously, there are a lot of things that can go wrong in the human body in space, and so now and historically, pharmaceuticals are often used to treat various conditions or prevent them from occurring in the first place. As of recording, you can currently find a fairly extensive list of drugs that are on board the International Space Station. Since in-game we're seeing this as an advertisement, it's likely some sort of over-the-counter drug, and if I had to guess, it would probably most likely be something for stress reduction. Occasionally throughout the game, we see several of these posters illustrating that EarthGov is delivering supplies to Titan Station. This is essential because creating a fully closed ecological system in which you don't need external supplies is a very difficult engineering task that has been attempted over the years but still has yet to be achieved. Essentially, this is due to inefficiencies in recycling processes, as there's always going to be some waste left over for any sort of resource recycling that you're performing within this closed system. So far, some of the most effective closed ecological systems that have been attempted are the BIOS 3 program in Soviet Russia and the Biosphere 2 program at the University of Arizona. So if you're interested in further research on this topic, those would be great examples. But unlike a literal space city, however, these habitats only housed a few people. So to scale up these life support technologies to the extent where you would be able to sustain a large number of people over a pretty large space station, you would either need very advanced technology for effective recycling or a constant supply of resources from Earth or other planets. And in fact, due to entropy, this is probably going to be the case for most of human existence. Although ironically, in the Dead Space universe, Earth also needs resources from extraterrestrial settlements, so both on- and off-world settlements are relying on each other for sustenance. As this medical facility is being locked down, one of the bulkhead doors has a protective gate lowered over it before fully closing. Depending on the sorts of control systems at play here, this might be an effective way to prevent anybody from getting stuck between the doors as they're closing, which probably could have come in handy for some of the massively overpowered doors that we've seen in this series. Ah, good, we have some fire extinguishers readily available, except that they've been secured behind an impenetrable plane of transparent aluminum. Well, at least it'll look good on the safety report. Inside the hospital triage room, we can see an effective use of the stasis technology to preserve people in suspended animation for long enough for medical personnel to effectively heal them. Now, there is a maintenance report we can find on the floor here that has what appears to be some nonsensical technical jargon, and while it does seem mostly nonsensical, there's a few buzzwords here that we can translate. Tachyon is a term for any particle that is moving faster than the speed of light. And as I'm sure you probably heard from numerous science fiction sources by now, moving faster than light is an important part of causality violation and time travel and lots of other things that are interesting enough in their own right, but not really relevant enough to go into great detail here. Degaussing, or however it's pronounced, is a process of eliminating residual magnetic fields from an object or mechanism. Apparently this is a thing for CRT monitors, although that's a little bit before my time. The term Heisenberg fork could refer to a number of things that Werner Heisenberg contributed to theoretical physics and other fields, but the most familiar of these is his uncertainty principle, which very briefly stated means that in the process of measuring a particle, you disrupt the motion of the particle, and so it's impossible to be 100% certain about that particle's motion before you took the measurement. This has a lot of implications in quantum physics, so there could be a variety of ways in which it would apply here. Another potential interesting thing that I found while looking up things related to Heisenberg was the notion of a Heisenberg cut, which at a very basic level would essentially be the box in Schrödinger's cat experiment, where it marks the boundary between what is known and unknown. So perhaps the Heisenberg fork could somehow bridge this cut. This is quite speculative though, and probably one of the less defined elements in this text. The term induction coil is often more commonly referred to simply as an inductor. Essentially, when a current passes through this coil, it produces a magnetic field, which then produces a voltage which opposes the applied voltage, and thus opposes the increase in current through the inductor. Now, I'm a mechanical engineer and not an electrical, so there's probably much better explanations out there of how inductors work. But the fact that this text describes these induction coils as firing probably means these coils are being used for their ability to generate a magnetic field more so than resisting an electric current. The fact that they're firing in sequence means there's more than one of them, and this method of operation could be similar to what you would see in a coil gun. There's also a note in the report about testing for a shattered matrix. Now, I am also not a mathematician, but apparently there is such a thing as shattering in set theory, which is applicable in Vapnik-Chervonenkis theory, which relates to machine learning, otherwise known today as AI. Now, if you're a mathematician, first of all, I'm sorry, but also I appreciate any extra explanation you could give in the comments. For our purposes, though, we can say this probably relates to testing whether or not the machine learning aspect of the stasis system is operating correctly, which means that perhaps it continually analyzes its performance to adjust parameters to make sure that the stasis system remains in operation. And finally, from this report, we can see that all of this testing took a solid full day of work. This could either mean that this technology, whatever it might be, is so thoroughly understood and applied that it's not really a big deal to be working with it at this stage, or the maintenance guy just decided to write off a full day of work. As for the stasis beds themselves, the design implies that they produce sort of a bubble of stasis around a patient who's laying down on the bed. This behavior, if it was to be the case, would also tie in with this shimmering film that we see, which clearly resembles an activated Stargate. This may or may not be relevant to its method of operation, but it perhaps gives us an idea for the basis for the design. There's also a warning sticker next to one of the beds that there is non-ionizing radiation present in this vicinity. Now, without knowing the exact method of operation for the stasis system, there's no way to know exactly what sort of radiation this would be, but one likely source could be Cherenkov radiation, which is produced anytime a particle moves through a medium faster than the local speed of light. Essentially, it's like the optical version of a sonic boom. The most familiar example of this is whenever a nuclear reactor underwater starts up, it will produce radiation that moves through the water faster than the local speed of light, which then produces a blue glow. And so, as mentioned in the previous Dead Space video, the blue coloration of stasis effects could perhaps be in reference to this phenomenon. Since we'll see these terminals quite a lot throughout the game, we can suppose that these are some sort of portable diagnostics tool that can be connected to existing equipment and correct them at a software or electronic level. It is rather curious that they are so large for this application, though, considering the general trend of computer miniaturization, but there is a high voltage warning on the exterior of the compartment, meaning that perhaps there could be some more advanced electronics involved. As a result of this, the scene could also be functioning similarly to what we saw with the Kinesis module, where Isaac acquires some sort of amplifier to boost the output capabilities of his current system. As far as why he would have this on his patient's straitjacket, the most likely explanation could be that it is somehow related to the Kinesis emitter, and perhaps the stasis blast is another output mode of this emission technology. But again, without knowing the exact mechanism of how stasis works, this will have to remain somewhat speculative. Fittingly, inside the hospital morgue, we find the first instances of marker text being used in labels. And if you know anything about the first game, you'll know that this is a very bad sign. Not to fear though, it will definitely get much worse. Broadly speaking, the psychological stress of living in an isolated and confined environment, such as space, is likely to be much more pressing than what one might experience on Earth. Separation from other people, the limitations on supplies, and the constant threat of danger or death from decompression would all weigh heavily on an astronaut's mind. And while being in a place as populous as a space city would help alleviate some of this stress, it's still not an optimal environment from a human perspective. So these counseling services available at the medical center are definitely going to be very valuable. Now there's also a somewhat darkly ironic point I realized about this, and that is, without going into details or using words that YouTube doesn't like, this is probably one of the most effective means of countering unitology on the station. But we're skipping ahead a little bit there. But if you know where the story is going, this is pretty relevant. Now throughout Dead Space 2, there are 4 conduit rooms that can only be accessed by having a save file from Dead Space Ignition on the hard drive of your Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3. However, since I'm playing on PC, I was able to find a mod that would open up these rooms. The rooms contain what appear to be high reliability conduits or junction boxes connecting important electronics components. Or in other words, these are the junctions of critical infrastructure that you cannot have go down under any circumstances. On the corners of these walls, there are several panels covering strands of cables, each of which have several radiation hazard labels affixed. If you are actually using radioactive components in an area that's not going to be fully enclosed to nearby personnel, that's going to be a bad idea. But if you're going to be doing that in a hospital, that's an even worse idea. especially since you're already probably getting enough space radiation as it is. That is, assuming that these radiation warning signs are actually accurate. More on that later, though. Now, I've said this a lot in my other reviews, but just in case you haven't seen them, these explosive decompression sequences that we often see in science fiction are almost always very unrealistic. At standard temperature and pressure, there just isn't enough wind that's actually going to be flowing out into the vacuum of space to actually lift you off your feet or haul off heavy objects into space. However, there are a couple of small details we can point to give this scene a bit of grace. For one, immediately before the explosion, we can see that there is a pressure vessel right next to the glass door that is already on fire, and thus would make sense that it could explode at any moment. The shockwave from this explosion could offset the balance of pressure throughout the room, and thus give a momentary increase in the pressure of the air that's flowing out to the exterior. Also, from a couple of the signs right outside this room, we can see that there are high-pressure gases in use. So perhaps it could be possible that if one of these high-pressure gas systems had malfunctioned, the room could have been pressurized beyond standard atmospheric pressure, and thus there would be an increased amount of air in the room that would be flowing outside, thus producing an increased force. On this last point, though, with the door behind Isaac still being open, that high-pressure gas would also be venting back out into the walkway, which, especially if it was going to be high pressure enough to cause the scene we see here, probably would have been more noticeable upon the door opening. So yes, these decompression sequences are just about always unrealistic, but this one has at least a few things going for it. Also, the blast doors having a shoot to close system, not sure how good of an idea that is. I suppose you could argue that the targets are made to automatically seal the blast doors if an object hits them on the way out. But, as we just discussed, it's highly unlikely that the vacuum will be strong enough to pull heavy objects at any appreciable speed.
Warning. Decompressed area beyond this point. Vacuum suits are required for entry.
Unlike a lot of other rooms we've seen so far in this series, the computer actually warns you in this instance that a vacuum is present and that you'll be needing a spacesuit to enter. Detecting whether or not a patient is wearing a spacesuit should be fairly easy considering that they already have a lot of their personal information available on the rig, and monitoring the room's pressure is just as simple as a vacuum sensor. So this combination of relatively simple technologies results in a safer environment. Oh yeah, another thing about buying this game on Steam is that all of the DLC items come unlocked in the store for free. But to maintain the continuity of the story and the way the game was meant to be played, I'll only use the tools and suits as they come up in the game normally. I can still remember quite vividly from my first time playing this game how cool it was to see the engineering suit again, as well as the sequence of being confused why there was no helmet, followed by pretty much the coolest thing I'd ever seen. For a few years after this, I actually did attempts on several occasions to design some sort of unfolding helmet that could function the same way as we see in game. And granted, this was a long time ago, so while I might have more success if I tried it now, the big challenge that I found back then was fitting all of the different actuators and motors into the mechanism that would unfold the helmet, as well as getting all the solid components to actually seal properly. Getting the helmet itself to origami into a shape that can be stored in the suit, though, seems at least a little bit easier than the more dynamic aspects of the helmet. So I don't think it's necessarily impossible to accomplish this, but it also seems like it's probably more trouble than it's worth when you can just have a spacesuit helmet to go along with the suit. Especially if the helmet were to be damaged and you couldn't fully retract it back into the suit, or you damage the suit by attempting to retract it. You'd also have to make sure not to damage the head inside of all this machinery as well. As we saw in the remake, when entering a vacuum in Dead Space 2, the color tint of the game changes slightly to a bit more of a bluish color. Now, while I don't know if this exact color shift is realistic in itself, there is actually a slight difference in perception when you're looking at something through air versus a vacuum, since the air will scatter and absorb some light. It might not be much, but the difference between air and a vacuum might be subtle enough to affect your perception without you maybe consciously being aware of it, which is yet another thing that can kind of serve to throw your brain off when you first get into space. Inside the ambulance loading bay, we can see a map of Titan Station with all of its medical facilities highlighted. For the most part, they're pretty well spread out across the station to reduce the time required to get to a medical facility from any given point on the station. From this time, we can also see that the station is being constructed in a radial direction. Essentially, more ground is being added to the station's ground plane. And as I mentioned in Infinite Warfare, while the lack of gravity in space might afford some more novel design options, building with the familiar definition of up and down would result in less difficulty navigating such a structure, compared to something like the International Space Station, where every surface is utilized for something. As for the presence of space ambulances themselves, without the presence of roads, they would almost be essential for getting patients that are located somewhere within the metropolis of Titan Station to one of these several medical centers. It's also cool to see that this is the second space city I reviewed, and both of them do have these space ambulances. One other nice little detail about this ambulance bay is that there are markings on the floor to show patients and passengers the direction that they should follow. Just a nice little quality of life detail.
I need more answers. How long have I been here?
3 years. Tideman found you floating in space near Aegis 7 and brought you here for study.
A cool detail here about the story is that Dead Space 1 came out in 2008 and Dead Space 2 in 2011, a 3-year gap which is also reflected in the game's story. I'm not sure how common this is nowadays or since, but it's a nice little bit of added immersion to the story, especially if you are playing it immediately upon release. Along the walls of this hallway, we see a number of signs indicating that there is hot metal or high voltage that you should not touch, along with several ladder-like brackets that are not steps. I'll try not to harp on this too much in this video, but if these are hazardous components that humans should avoid contact with, they should at least be secured behind some kind of panel, especially given how much space is available on these walls. Going on into the vehicle maintenance room, there's a pair of mechanical arms that appear to be intended to receive one of these space ambulances from the platform above. The floor plan of the hallway to get here doesn't exactly line up with this, but it's close enough that it seems like this is the idea. And I'm not exactly sure what else this room would be for with these giant arms, because there's not enough space to get anything else in here. Now this room seems a little bit small to house the entire space ambulance, but you could use it to access the underside of it, like you might see during an oil change on your car. And to that end, the space ambulances could be designed in such a way that they are most easily maintainable from this underside access, such as with the location of refueling ports. Like I mentioned in the last maintenance duct section, one of the potential hazards you'd have to be aware of when using these ducts would be hazardous gases. And we can see based on some of these warning labels that fumes may be present within this duct. Which if that's the case, this would also be a hazardous area to access without a portable breathing apparatus. We also see that there are some hot surfaces within the duct, but this does actually make sense if the duct is used as a ventilation system, since there would be cold air flowing over these surfaces and providing them cooling. But at least we see that this maintenance duct has been calibrated, whatever that's supposed to mean. The opening of Chapter 2 finds Isaac in the futuristic equivalent of a hardware store. This is a little bit curious since we have the Stantec vendors available throughout the station, as well as on the Ishimura in Dead Space 1. But it's certainly possible this is just an older store, or perhaps has a more expanded or niche catalog for tools and other hardware that would be necessary for different jobs. Similarly to hardware stores today, we can see that there are quite a few different vendors that sell wares in this store. As far as I could tell in the wiki, the only ones that have an appearance in-game are Tim's & Tools, which is the company that manufactures the Javelin gun and Rivet gun. There's also a nanocircuit repair bench in this hardware store. Now obviously for something with as much precision involved as nanoscale circuitry, you're not going to just be manipulating these circuits by hand. What's possibly more likely would be that these circuits are already in place on the tool or equipment, and then the power nodes are being used to fully power or even overclock those circuits once the nodes are inserted into the device. This could perhaps be used as a safety measure where certain tools can be unequipped of certain abilities, making them less capable of injuring personnel. Or perhaps more likely in this setting, it could perhaps be a way for the tool manufacturer to effectively create DLC for their hardware, where you have to pay extra after acquiring the device in order to access its full functionality. Which sounds awful, but in fact not too long ago Intel actually started doing this with their CPUs. This is also a thing with some brands of vehicles as well. And in the Dead Space universe at least, if the logic behind this could be either for safety or for profit, there's probably a clear answer. Inside a secure supply room, we can see a quarterly report for the economic status of Titan Station. As one could probably imagine, the Ishimura incident has not been good for business lately, and as a result, Titan Station appears to be entering an economic recession. Fortunately, at least by all appearances, EarthGov Research is providing enough funding to keep the station afloat. Now, I am definitely not an economist, so I could be off on these points, but it's interesting to note that the disastrous failure of the Ishimura mission has depressed the planet-cracking industry so significantly that support services are going out of business. In this universe, planet cracking is all but essential for the continued survival of humanity in addition to supporting off-world settlements. So if an industry that is so highly important to the survival of humanity is now facing economic hard times, and as a result, the industry as a whole is suffering, this would seem to indicate that the economic capacity of this industry itself was never very stable to begin with. Now, assumedly, EarthGov could buoy planet-cracking industry to prevent an absolute collapse of humanity, but this could then lead to other negative economic effects such as inflation. The point of all this being that if one planet-cracking failure can result in an economic failure for the entire industry, that economy was probably pretty shaky to begin with. Again, I'm an engineer and an economist, so if you have more expertise in this field, please feel free to correct me, as I'm sure this whole situation would involve many far-reaching implications that would probably take too long to go into for this review. These video doorbells we see in the Titan Heights apartments are not too dissimilar from the video doorbells we see today. However, it is rather curious that there is a camera feed showing the inside of the apartment, in addition to presumably another camera feed on the inside showing what's outside. This is especially odd considering studio-sized apartments where this camera feed basically shows the entirety of the inside. Unfortunately, this would also mean that visitors with ill intent could determine whether or not somebody is home based on their video screen, assuming of course there's no security system to prevent this screen from showing up normally. This could perhaps relate to security regulations to ensure that citizens can be continuously monitored within their homes. As discussed during Chapter 1, the amount of closure of an ecological system is highly dependent on the amount of waste that's produced by the system. And so maintaining a self-sustaining space settlement would be greatly benefited by reducing waste to the greatest extent possible. This would be especially important for organic compounds that make up the circle of life, but would also be beneficial for preserving resources that could be still useful after they've gone through a consumer usage, such as something like aluminum cans or plastic bottles, since even these are going to be expensive to transport to a distant location such as a space city. The ventilation in the Titan Heights hallways is primarily located on the hallway ceilings. Now, in the presence of gravity, there's no problem with this, since cold air sinks and hot air rises. In the absence of gravity, and thus the absence of a buoyant force, this no longer is the case. And so for operation in the absence of gravity, you'd want airflow coming from the other walls and the ground to have effective air conditioning and for preventing buildup of gas pockets. As discussed previously though, if the gravity of this residential space is sufficiently redundant, then this backup ventilation and air conditioning system may not be considered necessary. There appears to have been a pressurized pocket of air within this room that happens to explode at just the right point in time, preventing you from proceeding past this point until this mini cutscene is over. How convenient. Inside one of these apartments, we can see that the outer covering of one of the walls has been torn back in this location. We can see what appears to be some sort of composite structure underneath, covered over with some sort of fibrous insulation. Now this is probably getting into more civil engineering, and we're not going to go down that road here. But in modern spacecraft at least, multi-layer insulation, or MLI, is an important part of thermal management of satellite and spacecraft systems. While this wall coating does appear superficially similar to it, MLI is typically used to prevent radiative heat transfer, and generally isn't as effective at preventing conductive or convective heat transfer, so it wouldn't make as much sense to use inside of a building. Unlike in the first game, where the dark settings of the quarantine rooms was intentional, here it appears this is primarily due to local power failures. Fortunately, the power system is intelligent enough to identify these failure points and automatically reroute power supply to fix affected areas automatically. This detection could be accomplished with load monitoring circuitry, such that when the current draw of any certain area drops, the system can identify that it's probably running out of power. It does, however, still seem to take its sweet time. Inside one of the apartment common spaces, we can see a poster for Sun Cola indicating that they have been in business since the year 2190. Seeing as Dead Space 2 is set in the year 2511, this means that the Sun Cola company has been operating for 221 years. At least in America, I'm really not used to seeing many companies that are still around after this amount of time, but I have heard this is more common in other parts of the world. Considering how big modern-day soda companies are, it definitely doesn't seem implausible that Sun Cola could have been around for this long in the Dead Space universe. On the topic of these large common spaces in the apartments, this would definitely help to reduce the sense of confinement that residents would feel living in a space station. There is quite a lot of surface area to these windows though, increasing the chances of orbital debris impacts, but this could be mitigated with sufficiently capable asteroid defense systems, and the presence of the rest of the city would also serve to limit the potential incoming angles at which orbital debris could strike the windows. Although I suppose there still could be the hazard of people playing golf in space. At this point, we come across the first historical report on the advent of planet cracking as a result of the unified field theory. This report indicates that Titan was the first target for this operation, due to faster-than-light travel being still relatively new at the time. Now, as far as mining moons goes, most of the moons that you'll find in the outer solar system are icy, meaning that they have a lot of frozen ice around a solid rocky core. As far as the usefulness of this rocky core, it really depends on the technological processes available at the time, but more likely could be that these mining operations are designed to harvest water from these moons. While faster-than-light travel will allow much more regular transportation from Earth of water to locations of other settlements, such as on Mars, it's still going to be expensive, and you still also have to keep water on Earth. So having massive supplies of water from the outer solar system that can essentially be looted entirely from the moons that are being mined would offer an alternative to shipping water from Earth to space colonies. Possibly with less economic impact on the homeworld as well, since the quantities of water that could be derived from the outer solar system could perhaps be much larger than that could be taken from Earth without impacting the local population. This isn't to say you couldn't harvest useful mineral resources from moons as well, and this would come in handy for construction operations taking place far away from established civilization. At least in the early stages of space settlements, keeping the population alive will be the first priority. And to that point, a readily available supply of water might be more immediately important, but once the settlements have become sustainable and you're looking to expand them, then mineral mining operations could become more profitable. With this in mind though, Titan is a terrible choice for a first moon to harvest. From an economic perspective, the atmosphere of Titan contains hydrocarbons that could be readily used for fuel, and these hydrocarbons are also present on the surface of Titan in lakes. So mining this moon would essentially be like digging up the ground underneath a gas station so that you can get the gasoline out of the pumps. I mean, it might work, but then you're getting rid of your gas station as well. Harvesting Titan would also be a pretty bad idea from a scientific perspective as well. Titan has a very complex composition of chemicals within its atmosphere and surface, so much so that in some ways Titan could be considered to be one of the most Earth-like locations in the solar system, at least as far as chemical compositions go. I know it's not a perfect analogy, but the point of it is that if there's anywhere in the solar system where scientists could actually have a pretty feasible chance of finding life, Titan would be a pretty good spot for that. In addition to hydrocarbons, Titan's atmosphere also contains tholins, which are theorized to be the precursors to organic life. Now this gets into exobiology, and there's a whole lot to discuss there that won't be relevant until the next game in this series. The point being that from either an economic or a scientific perspective, Titan is a pretty terrible choice for a mining operation where the entire moon is dismantled. If you were after a more rocky moon, I might suggest Io, which is orbiting Jupiter and thus closer to Earth than Saturn. And if you really had to dismantle a major moon for ice, you could pick Enceladus, also orbiting Saturn. Although I would be sad to see it go because the geysers on Enceladus are pretty spectacular. But we do have to get back to this future timeline in which Titan has already been dismantled. And just about everything else there is also starting to fall apart.
There are necromorphs everywhere. Is the entire sprawl infected? How'd this happen? The marker was destroyed, Dana. I destroyed it.
You destroyed a marker, Isaac. Tiedemann built another one.
On this station? Why?
It's powerful alien technology. Tiedemann wants that power. Get to the tram. It'll take you to the Cassini Tower's turn station.
Dana? Damn it.
Rather ironically, using a mod to access these rooms is also the only way to unlock the hacker suit on the PC version. I'll also note here that there is a story DLC for Dead Space 2 for a different character that was never released on the PC version, so I wasn't able to play it for this review. I'm sure it's possible to do so on PC, but I think we can still do a pretty thorough review without it. Titan Station utilizes a tram system for public transportation across the space station. At the scale of this space city, it's not inconceivable that there could be roads of some kind throughout the station for driving traditional vehicles along. However, the tram system approach does make a bit more sense from a simplicity perspective. It keeps all transportation systems on a more readily controllable system that has less variability to it. The location of each tram at any point in time could be tracked, and any anomalies in performance can be monitored and dealt with more quickly. This would also be less prone to accidents than a highway. This would also factor into safety considerations for the station as well, since a car accident on a space highway could potentially be very dangerous if it compromises the structural integrity of the station. This would also mean that it is less likely for an individual to intentionally damage the station in this way as well, at least theoretically. From the timetable and the layout of the departure platform, we can see that there are 2 tracks going in and out of Titan Heights, the apartment building in which we're currently located. Interestingly, Titan Heights is also listed on the timetable, so it's possible that this location is large enough that there is an internal tram that goes between 2 different points in this apartment complex. We also see that there are at least 3 different tram lines: TST, the public transportation system, a CEC line, presumably for professionals who are working with the CEC and possibly continuing the mining operation on Titan, and the EarthGov line, which allows authorized personnel into the government sector. Dividing up the tram lines in this way could help reduce congestion on the higher reliability lines, such as those leading to the government sector. It could also help ensure that there is always space available on the trams for bringing mining equipment to and from the remaining core of Titan. There are also 2 stations listed at the Gamma Hub, one which has an additional designator, and is also on the Omega track instead of the Alpha, which is serviced by the CEC line. This could suggest this is a newly developed area that has only recently been open to the public. Alternatively, this could be one of the locations from which the mining operation is continuing into the interior of Titan. As far as the names of the different terminals, Cassini Towers is named after the Cassini-Huygens mission, which is the first and currently only landing of an artificial object on a moon in the outer solar system. Galileo Square is obviously named after Galileo Galilei, who is probably now best known for his discovery of moons of Jupiter, but who also observed Saturn's rings, mistaking them for moons. Altman Plaza is named after a character in Dead Space that we will talk about in the very near future. One little thing I'll point out without going into too much detail on is the inclusion of Galileo's name nearby that of Altman. If you're more familiar with the 1600s than I am, you'll probably know that Galileo ran into some trouble with the Roman Catholic Church due to his astronomical observations and inferences on the motion of the planets. In a sense, this is almost the inverse of what happened with Michael Altman, but again, we'll be covering that in much more detail not too long. Inside one of the tram cars, we can find a poster that seems to be oriented to kids, illustrating several extinct species of animals. Among these are chimpanzees, bees, and hippos, which to varying extents are endangered in the current day. However, also included on this list are dolphins and bears, which, based on my limited research, don't seem to be as much of a concern compared to these other species. We could surmise that the extinction of dolphins could have been due to pollution of the oceans and the extinction of bears due to deforestation. But this is really beyond my scope of expertise, so if you're more knowledgeable in this area, please feel free to leave a comment and correct me if I'm wrong or provide some additional context for this. In any case, the theme of extinction does come up a bit more in the next Dead Space game, but again, that's a topic for another time. One quick little detail here that's kind of neat is whenever you open up the mission tabs of the inventory menu, Isaac will look to the tab on the left while you're scrolling through the objectives and then to the right when you start reading them. It's a pretty small detail, but it's cool to see that the developers did include it. It's kind of difficult to tell here, but it appears that the tram is just traveling through the vacuum of space without any sort of enclosure around it, and that this bridge between the different tram cars is also exposed to vacuum. On the one hand, the absence of atmosphere would increase the efficiency of the tram transportation, since you wouldn't have air resistance slowing it down. But if any one of the tram car windows was punctured, or if the tram car had to stop in place for an extended amount of time, you could quickly run out of oxygen for anybody on board. As far as the tram cars themselves, we could say that the doors aren't meant to be opened except when in stations, but in that case, the connection between cars should still be pressurized so that in an emergency, you could get out of one car into another one. On the contrary, though, throughout the tram ride, we can hear the wind rushing past the car, which would mean that there would have to be air present to make that sound, and the wind is even stronger upon jumping out of the tram to boost to the disconnected car. So we could perhaps say that there is a pocket of air that's being held around these cars, perhaps using the unified field theory, or we could say that this is just an oversight from the developers. Also during this boost sequence, we can note the intense speed at which Isaac is traveling between these cars, or at least the apparent speed between cars. Because the 2 tram cars are moving at the same speed along the track, they have very little relative velocity to each other. And so if they were closer together, Isaac could have just jumped from one to the other without having a propulsion system involved. So the reason it would take so long to get from one car to the other would have to be then because of air resistance that's blowing back against him, slowing him down. Also, if we assume that there's no gravity between the 2 cars due to Isaac flying basically linearly, if there wasn't any air in this tram tunnel, then there wouldn't be anything to slow you down from simply jumping straight out from one car into the next. Thus, the time it takes to get from one car to the other implies that there is air along the tramway, even though at some points on the tram's route we can see that it seems to be traveling outside of any pressurized volume.
I thought we lost you.
Unscheduled stop. Where am I?
How did you end up there? Hang on. This won't be the most pleasant route, but it'll get you to the Cassini Towers residential sector.
After a slight detour into an unknown region of the station, we arrive in some sort of cargo hangar, followed by a venture through a corridor filled with high-power electrical cables. Judging by the triple-prong connections on some of these cables, we can assume that these are AC power lines. Now, being a mechanical engineer myself, most of my electrical background is with DC circuits. However, there are some observations we can make without an extensive electrical background. For one, each of these compartments appears to contain an identical wiring harness as all the others. This would suggest that this is some sort of power distribution room where a variety of perhaps electrically similar systems are routed through, which could imply that this room is a distribution center for power to various buildings. Judging from the sparks in some of the malfunctioning compartments, we can assume that there's a lot of power going through these lines. And alternating current is generally better at transmitting power over longer distances than direct current circuits, which would make sense if the power flowing through this room was going to be distributed to various buildings across a larger portion of the station. As for the cables themselves, a lot of them are routed along the ceiling and are drooping behind the support points, which would unnecessarily introduce strain into these cables that could potentially shorten their lifespans. We also see that a lot of these cables appear to connect to a junction box within one of the ventilation ducts, which could imply that there is a power distribution and switching circuit within this ventilation system that utilizes the added airflow for extra cooling. At this point in the game, we're able to equip the Hacker's suit after using a rather meta mod implementation to unlock the earlier conduit rooms. Now, without even needing to go through an extended analysis, we can see that the suit does not fully cover Isaac's body. In fact, most of his head would still be exposed to the vacuum of space if you were to wear this out into a vacuum, which we can do later in the game. While the face mask does still presumably provide a rebreather to allow you to continue to breathe while wearing the helmet, the ears are still exposed to vacuum, which I imagine would be very uncomfortable to say the least. Not having the skin pressurized would also result in expansion of the skin around the neck and throat area, which would potentially cause issues with breathing. This would also happen over the scalp as well, but the helmet head straps might help alleviate some of this discomfort. However, since the suit is normally only unlockable by having a save file from Dead Space Ignition, it's probably safe to say that this is intended more as a bonus suit than an actual part of the story. Also, I don't know if it's just me, but this suit also reminds me of a game called Dark Void, which I never actually played more than the demo of, but the main character in that game also had a pretty similar suit. Not sure if the design is inspired by that or not. Dark Void also came out 1 year before Dead Space 2, so it's at least not anachronistic to suppose that this could perhaps be a reference to that game. Eventually, we make our way to the Concourse, a local shopping center with a variety of stores. The inclusion of these facilities on board Titan Station implies that its economy, at least at one point, must have been strong enough for its citizens to have surplus income. From another historical report we find in the Concourse, this is in keeping with Titan Station's center as a travel hub for various scientific and business endeavors in the outer solar system. And presumably there would be a lot more shopping centers like this spread across the station. Assuming Titan Station has a sales tax, this would also provide another means of income for the station, which, while probably not as great as its profits from mining, could still potentially be valuable in keeping the station economically afloat. In fact, as a travel destination, Titan would also probably have quite a lot of tourist trap type attractions as well. A couple of the stores in the Concourse deserve a little bit of extra attention. One of these is a store selling zero-gravity levitation beds. In many historical reports, astronauts often say that they have a lot more trouble sleeping in space than they do on Earth. And especially if your body is used to sleeping in a gravitational environment, it's going to take some time to get adapted to microgravity, which applies to a lot of things, but also to sleep. There is perhaps some evidence to suggest that a partial gravity environment could make a little bit of a difference for sleeping than a zero gravity situation. Although at least when related to the current day, there would be a much different psychological experience of sleeping in microgravity because you bought a bed to do that, and sleeping in microgravity because you're an astronaut on a space station. Another concern with sleeping in microgravity is the potential buildup of carbon dioxide pockets around an astronaut's head. Since there's no gravity to disperse the air that you're exhaling, it can potentially build up into pockets that are not dispersed quickly enough by the flow of air around you. Lack of buoyancy in microgravity also contributes to this behavior. This is why it's especially important to have ventilation in places where crew members are going to be sleeping, so that you always have airflow that's refreshing the air around an astronaut's head, and preventing them from inhaling an excessive amount of carbon dioxide while they're sleeping. And depending on the implementation of microgravity in this levitation bed, this may or may not be something you have to worry about while sleeping here. One other noteworthy store we can find is a Japanese establishment that, based on Google Translate, appears to be focused on selling objects made of wood. Regardless of whether this translation is accurate or not, plants and presumably wood-based objects could potentially help with stress relief to give a bit more of a familiar environment to what we might find on Earth. Although in the Dead Space universe this might not be as relatable as it is today, depending on the status of the resource-limited Earth. And wood also is more of a fire hazard than fireproof materials that you might otherwise find on a space station. But even so, it would still potentially have value for psychological purposes, which is still an important factor to take into account regarding the human element of spaceflight. We can also see what appears to be a fitness store in the concourse. Regardless of how much, if any, space on Titan Station has been allocated for fitness centers, exercise is almost essential for human survival in space. Numerous systems of the body experience reduced performance if they're not exercised when in outer space, primarily owing to the lack of gravity and the associated lack of resistance on the body, and the fact that you can move almost effortlessly through space. An interesting example of this is that because of the lack of gravity, the heart has a lot less difficulty pumping blood, which sounds like a good thing, since the heart would be able to pump blood more effectively, but it actually takes so little effort that the heart muscles will eventually begin to atrophy, since they're not used to working so little. Thus you have to maintain a high enough heart rate to keep your heart pumping, as it would normally do on Earth, to account for the otherwise low effort that is required from it. This atrophy from low effort can also be seen in other muscles in the body, but the heart is a particularly notable example of this. Through these massive windows in the concourse, we can observe several massive screens on the outer edge of the station that are displaying a video of Director Tiedemann issuing an evacuation order. This large video is synchronized with speakers within the concourse to provide the accompanying audio. Fortunately, if you happen to be away from a speaker, there are subtitles in the video, even though the location on the screen means that they might not be visible from every location. And on that note, people would also have to be in a room with windows, and windows facing this direction, in order to be able to see these screens. Most likely, we can probably assume that these are projection screens rather than actual LCD or LED screens, since the costs associated with those would be massive, for what we could assume are probably very niche applications. One of which could most likely be advertising, since these are essentially giant billboards that you would have almost no choice but to look at anytime you look out into space. And it's definitely not hard to imagine that there'd be a lot of companies that would be willing to spend quite a lot of cash to get their products on such an unavoidable screen. Also located within the concourse on the next part of our route to our objective is a local church for the religion of Unitology. On that topic, I am certainly not qualified enough in my studies of world religions to say with complete confidence what group that Unitology is perhaps a parody of, and I definitely don't endorse harassment of anybody who you might think that this is a parody of. However, in order to establish enough context for this review, I will go over some of the details of Unitology over the course of this next section of the game. And if you know anything about the series, you know that Unitology is definitely not what it's advertised as. But if you knew everything about this series, you would know that Unitology, in a twisted way, actually is everything that it's advertised as. The unique ability afforded by the hacker suit allows Isaac to bypass security checks in these maintenance terminals with one less layer of security. Now perhaps a software designer or a computer engineer would have a better idea of how this might be possible, but my best guess would be that the computer systems of the hacker suit come equipped with some sort of more advanced cryptography software, or perhaps a physical tool that can help with overloading certain security circuits. Either way, this also points to its inclusion as more of a game bonus than a story feature.
I thought you were routing me to residential. This looks like a Unitology recruitment center. Am I still on track?
Yes. There's an old maintenance access point in there that'll take you through the waste disposal system and into the Cassini Towers. Stay sharp.
As we often see in science fiction settings in the vicinity of Saturn, the planet's massive rings are on full display here. This view, however, is unfortunately not scientifically possible, at least according to the astrodynamics of the current Saturnian system. As with most moons, Titan's orbit around Saturn is only slightly inclined with respect to the equator of Saturn. That is to say, Titan orbits nearly in the same plane as the rings of Saturn. So looking at the planet from the vicinity of Titan means that you would be basically viewing the rings edge on, and they would be very thin as a result. However, in dead space, the majority of Titan has been mined away, and whatever's left is a much lower mass than before the mining operations started. If this change in mass was significant, as it most likely was, then this could influence the orbital parameters of Titan around Saturn, and perhaps leading to a higher inclination of its orbit. Now, there's too many unknown parameters that would need to be known to go into calculating this, and regrettably, orbital mechanics is still not one of my strongest suits. But on top of all that, we are also operating in a science fiction setting with gravity manipulation available to us, and so moving Saturn into a different orbit is definitely not out of the question, at least as far as physics goes, because economics would be another big factor in this decision. At several points throughout the game, we can find these temporary walls that indicate where future construction is planned to take place. Now, on the one hand, I admire the modular approach here, as this implies that the station has been designed to be upgradable in the future. On the other hand, these temporary walls are often weak enough to be burst by a nearby explosion. Even if these aren't actually made of glass, this is still a major safety concern, especially in areas where you have heavy machinery operating, or in high traffic areas where a lot of people could be present during a breach. Our circuitous route takes us through a trash compacting facility that services 3 residential areas. As mentioned previously, recycling is going to be a pretty big deal on a station as large as this. So having a centralized area that can service the large influx of resources that need to be recycled from various residential areas seems like a pretty good idea. Presumably, once these resources have been collected and compacted, they can be sent off to a centralized recycling center. There's also a pretty obvious reference here to traveling through a trash compactor on your way to your destination, and if you're watching this video right now, I should hope you already know what sci-fi setting I'm referring to. In addition to making a probably more helpful observation about the increased difficulty using a holographic-only touch display, it's also curious to note the layout of this keyboard, with the letters in alphabetical order and only 6 digits to choose from, and no enter key. Perhaps this is a different or new standard for use in certain specific applications, but in any case, it still seems like there's not enough keys present here to actually be functional for most applications. Now, as cool as these zero-gravity sequences are, there are some physics and engineering elements of this that probably wouldn't fly in the real world, or at least would make it difficult to do so effectively. For one is the propulsion system itself. For one is the propulsion system that's being used throughout each of the various control areas. For one, the propulsion system is rather suspect. The thrusters on Isaac's feet and back act essentially as reaction control system thrusters, such as you might see on a satellite or rocket, to perform small adjustments to its heading. Now that in itself makes perfect sense, but the placement of the jets, at least superficially, seems potentially insufficient to navigate through space with full 6 degrees of freedom. That is, being able to translate in every direction and rotate about any axis. The other point of contention here would be the method of operation of these thrusters, and specifically where they're getting their propellant. Now in a setting with an atmosphere, this could be done simply by compressing gas and expelling it at a high velocity. So if you could actually work out the control systems and have an effective way of quickly compressing gas and expelling it, this seems like it could be feasible. However, in a vacuum setting, you're not going to have any medium around you to ingest into the system to provide propellant, and so you'd have to carry all of your propellant with you with onboard tanks. So this could still work in that instance, but you would only have a limited amount of propellant available on your person, giving you a limited number of bursts that you could apply to move you in any particular direction. And so you'd have to be very conservative with your motion in that setting, since once you use up all your propellant, you'd be free floating in space with no way to control yourself. The trash collection component of this waste management system uses high-powered fans to move waste packages along the tunnels leading to the compressor. In the absence of gravity, you wouldn't have any forces acting on an object that's just floating in space, so it wouldn't move anywhere on its own. Thus, by including a fan, you can get a force applied from the air movement that can be used to direct it into a specific direction. The amount of force required to move these trash bags can be determined from Newton's second law, where the applied force to get a specific acceleration is determined by the mass of the object you want to move. As we see in the game, Isaac is unable to fly against this airflow without the assistance of the rig's zero-G boosters. This means that these fans are providing at least enough force to move somebody of Isaac's size and mass along the tunnel at a non-insignificant acceleration. Equivalently, this means that it's also capable of moving trash bags that are approximately the same mass as Isaac. This is, of course, without taking into account surface areas and other aerodynamic effects, but at a basic level, we could say that these trash bags are going to be capable of holding at least around 200 pounds, which is probably a generous estimate considering how much these rigs are likely to weigh. Also, in my gameplay, the reason that I used one of these trash bags as a shield from the others is because of the physics I was expecting out of this situation. Despite these objects not having any weight in the absence of gravity, they would still have a significant mass, and that mass is still going to carry momentum. Basically, the point of this is that you could move one of these trash bags in zero gravity with your finger, but if it's already moving, it's going to take more than just one finger to stop it. Since these balloon-like diaphragms are located so close to the trash chute, my best guess as to their function would be that they are diffusing air that is recycled from the trash collection and processing systems. The air itself is still usable and valuable, it just needs to be purified first. So perhaps these diaphragms are performing that operation by having the polluted air pumped into the balloon and allowing the air to diffuse through a porous membrane. This could be done in a cyclical manner such that the balloons inflate with the polluted air, the gas diffuses out through the membranes, causing the balloons to deflate, and the remaining particulate matter stays inside the balloons to be flushed out into another processing system. There's also a symbol on these balloons that seems to suggest that they are used for some sort of recycling process, which would provide some support for this theory. Taking an elevator up from the waste management system, we finally arrive at the Cassini Towers residential space. And it's right around this point where, if you remember what happened in the first game, you realize that things are about to get very much worse.
Dana, Titan soldiers have found me. They're tracking me in some sort of gunship.
You're almost here. Hurry.
Dana, the Church of Unitology? Why here?
It's one of the few places on Titan Station that Tideman can't monitor. Separation of church and state.
No, Dana, we shouldn't be in here. This is the last place we want to be right now.
Isaac! My brother died trying to rescue you. This is important. This will work. I'm in a safe room at the top of the church. Meet me there, okay?
As we now find ourselves within the Church of Unitology on Titan Station, this is probably a good point to go over what exactly Unitology is all about, as well as a potential plot hole related to the core of Unitology. Much of this backstory is presented in Dead Space 2, but we have to fill in some blanks from information from Dead Space 3. That being said, I will try to avoid spoiling that story in case you haven't played it yet. Now, I will again state here that I do not endorse or condone harassment of any religion that you may or may not think that Unitology is or is not a parody of.
Welcome to the Titan Station Church of Unitology. We're glad you've come to visit our sanctuary and place of light and hope. Our tour guides are looking forward to showing you the best of our beliefs and what a meaningful and enlightening impact we can have in your daily life. There is, of course, no obligation of any kind with this tour. Kindly remember to stay with your tour guide at all times. Someone will be with you shortly.
So what exactly is Unitology then? In the year 2214, a black marker was discovered in the Yucatan Peninsula. This original black marker was found in the Chicxulub crater, presumably the location of the impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. Its existence was kept secret from the public by EarthGov while they were continuing studies on it, until eventually one of the researchers, Michael Altman, leaked the details of the marker to the public. However, not long after this grand revelation, Michael Altman was killed under suspicious circumstances. Two of his co-workers, who were heavily invested in the marker as a potential source of unlimited energy, painted his death as an assassination by EarthGov, in order to depict him as a martyr for the cause that they now sought to spread among the population of Earth, which was their own revelations about the marker's purpose. The result was the new religion of Unitology. After several hundred years, once we get to the point of Dead Space 2, the religion has grown pretty significantly, reportedly being one of the fastest growing religions in history. Essentially, the whole core of Unitology's beliefs is on the importance of the marker as a divine artifact whose power could lead to unlimited energy for humanity and eternal life in some form. As such, the marker features heavily in Unitologist imagery, along with the marker symbols, which are found on the exterior surface of markers. Now importantly, the black marker found on Earth was one of the original real markers. The one we see in Dead Space 1 is an artificial copy of the black marker, created after the black marker imprinted instructions for how to create red markers on the researchers on Earth. This imprinting is done by other markers as well, but will only take on intelligent people or those with compatible DNA. To everyone else, the instructions sound like noise that eventually drive them mad. And so the result of this is that the religion of Unitology, as one of its core tenets, assists in the worship and spreading of markers throughout human-controlled space. Which, if you know anything about the series, you'll probably recognize that this is not good. Now, this is all the actual lore of the Dead Space series. And as part of its propaganda, Unitology presents itself in a much more beneficial light, with a lot of self-actualization and spiritual practices as part of its tenets. One of the stranger of which, though, is the requirement that church members dedicate their bodies to the church after death.
Those who have been fortunate to be called ahead of church, where they will be looked after and cared for. This is not an occasion for grief, but an occasion to rejoice. Let us always remember that death is a blessing. Just as all life comes from the marker, all life will one day return to it. The body and soul will live on, with brothers and sisters, with families and friends, when the day of conversion arrives. For this is what the marker promises us, and this is what we know to be true. Always be praised.
So by now you can probably see where this is going. However, the full implications of unitology wouldn't be made known until the events that take place in Dead Space 3. I won't spoil that here, but if you watch the very end, there's a very insightful audio log that we could find close to the end of the game that I'll include to give us a bit more context. Now that we have that background, we can discuss the potential plot hole of this whole setting. The marker symbols that we see covering the surface of the red marker in Dead Space 1, and presumably all the other markers as well, correspond to letters, numbers, and some punctuation. And so by knowing what these symbols represent, we can read some of the scribblings that the unitologists have left throughout the station, as well as the symbols present in a lot of their artwork. This is where we start to run into a bit of inconsistency though. The marker symbols only correspond to the 26 letters, 10 numbers, 3 punctuation marks, and 2 phonetic symbols in Latin characters. So for example, there's no symbol that indicates the sh sound. Interestingly, there's also not a symbol for 0, limiting its usefulness for mathematics. This would mean that these symbols can only be translated into languages that use the standard Latin characters. And you wouldn't be able to fully utilize these symbols to communicate a language such as Russian, such as the H-like sound in chodit. I know I'm terrible at pronouncing Russian, but hopefully you get the idea. We also don't have modified characters such as an umlaut or a tilde, so words like mañana in Spanish or schön in German couldn't be fully transliterated using these symbols. The point of all this is that these symbols seem to have a preference for the English language, or at the very least Romance languages. However, ostensibly, these symbols were found originally on the surface of the black marker that was found in the Yucatan Peninsula. Since this original marker was an alien artifact, there would be no reason for these symbols to correspond specifically to Latin languages. So the only possible translation then would be that the transliteration of these symbols to Latin characters is an artificial doing. Essentially, if this marker had landed somewhere in Eurasia, the symbols could have been used to transliterate Cyrillic characters instead. This does of course depend on what languages are still present at the time of the discovery, but you get the point. However, it also appears that the symbols used by these markers are what it uses to communicate the codes to produce more markers. And the only way it could do this is if it was able to translate that code into the language that the person who is receiving the code speaks, and then convert that language into marker symbols.
Isaac, now you see the symbols too. It means something.
Strauss. Yes, I see the symbols.
We are a threat to them. I know it. We have to work together.
Work together? Who's them? What, you mean Titan? Strauss. Work with me, Strauss.
Given the marker's seemingly telepathic powers, we can assume that this is somehow possible. But this does introduce a contradiction to the teachings of unitology, in that the meanings of each of the symbols must therefore be artificial, since the original black marker that landed on Earth could not have been created in such a way that a particular language on Earth would just happen to match up exactly with the symbols. So if anything, this is less of a plot hole with the lore of Dead Space, and more so a plot hole in the teachings of unitology.
The Cathedral reported 2 pressure equalization cycles during services last Sunday. The first was minor and only blew some candle flames around, giving Pastor O'Brien a much-needed, if unexpected, boost in his sermon. The second cycle was more harsh, resulting in a pressure snap that popped people's ears and sent several to medical. That was not needed.
The pressure equalization system mentioned here is responsible for maintaining a safe pressure within a room that is within acceptable limits. If the pressure in the room gets too high, some air can be vented out to vacuum, or perhaps another adjacent room that's sealed off. Contrarily, if the pressure gets too low, then air can be pumped in from another room or a storage tank of some kind. It would make most sense for a system like this to be needed in a room that is directly adjacent to outer space. The presence of these fuses behind certain doors suggests that their conclusion here is to forcibly lock down a door, regardless of other systems' performance. It's rather curious that these fuses are built into the wall but seem to be connected to the door circuitry by a pair of cables that are going out into the hallway. So perhaps these power locks aren't meant to be continuously connected. The design of these power locks is actually fairly well done though, in that they utilize a fail-open behavior. That is to say, if the power is removed, the door is able to be opened normally. This would be in contrast to a fail-shut design, wherein if the power was removed, even accidentally, the door would remain in a closed and locked state, which would be much less convenient from a safety and accessibility perspective. These terminals within the indoctrination center appear to be using holographic screens to display images and shapes in front of inductees into unitology. While this is probably a less effective way of displaying 3D images than a VR headset would be, which wasn't really commercially available until about 5 years after this game came out anyways, but I digress, this sort of panoramic screen system would actually make sense as a way to project holographic images into 3D space. Technically, these are referred to as volumetric displays, and there are several techniques that have been used to create prototypes of these displays. But nowadays, with such technologies as glasses-free 3D, using head tracking, and readily available virtual reality technologies, this display technology hasn't really taken hold in the market yet.
Please replace the fuse for the observation center door in the junction panel. Vandalism in the church is not permitted.
These volumetric indoctrination displays appear to require a pretty high power consumption. With this high power door circuit breaker located in the same room, it makes sense that both of them would be wired in such a way that the fuses could be interchangeable between both systems. However, even after replacing the fuse, the door continues to cycle open and close very rapidly. Since we see some smoke coming out of the circuitry here, one possible explanation for this could be that the power supply is providing excessive current to the door circuit, at which point a safety circuit then terminates the connection, resulting in the door returning to its fail-shut state. This being an electrical circuit though, there's probably a lot of other ways that this could make sense from an electrical engineering perspective. Once again, in addition to a physically unrealistic vacuum, in order to seal off the breach in this room, we have to shoot a target at the top of the door in order to trigger the blast door to seal. If there were anyone in this room who wasn't armed with a plasma cutter or some sort of projectile weapon, this would most likely end pretty badly. At the very least, there is a sign on the door indicating that if the door is visible, somebody should probably tell a supervisor about that. The observation center has feeds from security cameras located throughout the Unitology Church. Rather oddly though, most of these monitors are not in matching aspect ratios, and they could probably have been arranged in a more effective manner. One possible explanation for this could be that the video feeds from the security cameras are being sent from the cameras in various aspect ratios. This would be very non-optimal if only a specific type of security camera was being used, but perhaps in this instance the facility has grown so much that various different brands of security cameras are being used with varying capabilities, with the additional irregular monitors being installed after the fact to account for these varying different aspect ratios of security cameras. This is perhaps a little bit generous though, as we see on some screens the same video repeated, just in a stretched or cropped form. So perhaps only the security monitors have been added to account for expansions to the church. Inside this maintenance duct, as well as occasionally in other ones, we can see a thin red wire hanging from supports on either side of the duct. Now this is not the most effective way to provide strain relief to an important cable that's going to be in place for an extended amount of time, with air blowing past it that could cause it to move slightly, as you might get creasing in the wire at the point where it's hanging from these hooks. And despite the general lack of consideration given to safety in this series so far, we could perhaps suppose that this wire is a sort of emergency signal. If you were to get stuck within this duct and you're starting to lose consciousness, or there's some other emergency that prevents you from leaving the duct, you could pull on this wire, which would trigger an alarm, indicating that additional personnel are required to get you out safely. But this is Dead Space we're talking about here, so it's probably none of the above. Once again, we come across a large room with large balconies, with no way to travel between the two floors other than a cargo lift. Now there's a reason that the inclined plane is considered a simple machine, in that you don't need to be an engineer to realize that building a stairway here would be much more simple than building a full-on cargo lift, not to mention redundancy and safety considerations.
Dana, you there?
Isaac, I can't unlock the elevator. Can you do anything from your end?
Let me see what I can do.
I suppose this lift does offer the benefit of controlled access between the floors, and making it easier to move large objects. And at least this time we see that there are more fall restraints than you typically see on these cargo lifts. Although there are still unprotected ledges next to the cargo lift without any railings to prevent people from falling over.
Welcome to the Basilica. The hauntingly beautiful hall serves as the starting point for many of our formal ceremonies. Its architecture is rich in symbolism, and the stained glass ceilings are forged from no less than the sands of Jupiter's long-lost moon Io.
Since planet cracking in Dead Space was able to be performed at Saturn's moon Titan, it should come as little surprise that Jupiter's moons would also be accessible for mining operations. Although once again, the high gravitational field of Jupiter could lead to additional difficulty with orbital insertion and retrieval of chunks of the Jovian moons. But in a world with gravity manipulation, these are still probably solvable problems. Now, I am most certainly not going to go through and translate every instance of marker symbols in this game. That being said, I did notice that there is a typo in the marker text over this preparation doorway. But if you would like to pause this video to translate any marker text you might see, be aware that there could be spoilers. Immediately before accessing the church morgue, which is probably the worst place you could possibly be on this entire station at this point in time, we encounter a large room with a staircase immediately after exiting an elevator. Why they couldn't just have the elevator go down a little further is a question for station architecture. The main note about this room, though, is the presence of condensation that is dripping down from the ceiling. The morgue requires a large amount of cryogenic fluids to preserve the bodies sent there from the Unitologist Church. As these cryogenic fluids flow along pipes, they cool the pipes themselves, and the difference in temperature with the surrounding atmosphere results in condensation onto the pipes. In the presence of gravity, this condensation then eventually bubbles up into large enough masses where its weight becomes too much for its own surface tension, and then it falls as a water droplet. And it just so happens that the one room where they actually have stairs to go between two different levels is also a room filled with dripping condensation, leading to a not insignificant slip hazard on these stairs. So on the one hand, it's nice that they finally figured out how to use the inclined plane, but this is also probably not the most optimal place to put one. The doors within the cryogenic morgue vault are built a bit differently from the doors we normally see throughout the rest of the station. Opening these doors consists of a pressure cycling sequence, followed by the primary structure of the door opening, and then an additional insulation layer opens. Fortunately, this system also does still have a manual override, it's just located in a different location compared to other doors, which is a bit inconvenient from a user operations perspective, but it's at least good that they still have one. Now, the door pressurization sequence does make sense from a conceptual level, considering that on one side of the door, you may have air that is much colder than on the other side, and thus from the ideal gas law, at a lower temperature, the pressure within the cryogenics room is likely lower than the air pressure in a room temperature room. So to avoid any trouble, the air pressure is equalized before fully opening the door. So it makes sense to have this pressure cycling system on the door before it opens, but it appears that the air is flowing out from the door rather than into it. Since the room temperature room is going to be at a higher pressure than the cryogenic room, the air would be flowing into the door rather than out of it. For going between two rooms that are both using cryogenics, differences in volume of the rooms could also lead to a difference in pressure. So the pressure equalization system still makes sense in that instance as well, though it would be harder to tell which direction the airflow should be going. In each of these cryogenics rooms, there are several of these small tanks inset into the walls. Some of these tanks are connected to what appears to be the primary ducting using a small connecting tube. Now, my first thought was that these might be some sort of air quality monitoring system, and that these tubes are providing samples of the room air to a filter or a monitoring system to detect any harmful gases or other compounds that could potentially pose a hazard to any living or non-living organisms. Alternatively, these tanks could be injecting some sort of additive into the air duct, which could perhaps be used to better preserve the bodies within the cryogenic storage units. However, in one of the rooms, we can hear that there is a cryogenic liquid being flown through these ducts, which means that they are not being used for air quality monitoring. If this is the case, I would say the additive injection is probably the more likely explanation then, especially since we see what appear to be reserve tanks located right nearby, such that the active tanks can be replaced once they run out. We see two large cryogenic dewars, or tanks, that are presumably operating as local reservoirs of cryogenic fluid. These tanks appear to be supplied from the top, without an obvious way that the cryogenic liquid could be pumped out from the tank, except for perhaps a concentric tap line that would be concentric with the supply line or vice versa. However, one nice little detail here is actually the presence of these relief valves. Now, whenever you're storing cryogenic liquids, you need to be mindful of boil-off that will occur as the liquid evaporates into a gas. This will happen anytime there's heat transfer from the outside of the tank to the inside, which will happen anytime the temperature outside the tank is higher than inside. So you need to have a way for this built-up gas to escape. Otherwise, it will pressurize the tank and potentially cause it to fail. And since it's a gas, in the presence of gravity, it will float up to the top of the tank volume. Thus, you'll need a relief valve at the top of the tank, which is what we see in game. Granted, the position of the valve handles is a little curious, since it appears that they are directly in line with the pipes, and in order to open them you'd have to get your hand pretty close to the outflow. But the outflow is at least pointed away from the walkable area of the room, unlike a certain scene in Dead Space 1. These cryogenic coffins appear to utilize a closed-loop system for flowing the cryogenic preservative fluid over the body, and flowing the remaining coolant out through a return line. Now this all makes sense as far as a coolant system goes, but the fact that you're essentially using an active cooling system using a cryogenic working fluid means that you're going to need to be expending a lot of energy in order to maintain the preservation of the bodies within these coffins. And perhaps a simpler method could simply be to expose them to the vacuum of space. I suppose this cryogenic system could perhaps be done to reduce off-gassing, if a certain chemical composition of coolants could be used to perhaps reduce this effect, but this is getting more into biochemistry, which isn't really my specialty.
Dana! I think I found the exit, but it's way above me. Gravity controls are locked out. Dana?
At the base of the cryogenic morgue vault, we find a room in which coffins are being loaded into the crypt using a zero-gravity transportation system. Based on a work order log we find, it appears that the gravity has been temporarily enabled in this room to perform maintenance. The log mentions that several of the coffin transportation tracks have been warped, perhaps from a coffin impacting the strut at an excessive velocity. The report also mentions that the cold of the crypt caused brittleness in the track welding. Now, most common metals experience what is called a ductile to brittle transition temperature. Above this temperature, the metal is ductile, in that it can be bent if you apply enough force. Below this temperature, though, the metal becomes brittle, meaning that it will crack if an excessive force is applied. Now, I'm not as personally familiar with the ductile to brittle transition temperatures of weldments, but if the metal used to reinforce the support struts on the tracks was of an improper composition that wasn't properly treated or intended to operate in the cold, we could get a situation like the one described in the work order. Also, another small point about this is that the way this work ticket is written sounds a lot like the way I would write a ticket like this. On the access walkways in this coffin control room, we can see some sort of effluence being dumped onto the walkable area. Based on the color of the fluid and our previous assumptions of how the cryogenic system is operating, we could suppose that this is the contaminants that the cryogenic fluid has picked up after flowing through coffins. In addition to this probably being a biohazard in itself, it's also probably creating a slip hazard on this graded walkway. Furthermore, when the gravity in this room is disabled, this fluid is just going to be spewing out into the room, where it will form bubbles that could interfere with the operation of other systems. It does appear that each of these outlets do have some sort of valve on them though, so perhaps these are only opened when the gravity is enabled. In addition to the general unsafety we've come to expect from these cargo lifts, this one appears to be particularly poorly designed from a mechanical perspective as well. The warnings of hot metal on the wall behind the lift most likely indicate that the heat in these metals is coming from friction. That is to say that the cargo lift is just scraping against the wall as it moves up and down, which will in turn heat up the wall and wear down both the wall surface and the lift itself. There are so many ways that this could have been better designed to not have this problem. It seems like it must be the work of either incompetence or absolute disregard for performance of the system. Or you could also easily get your hands caught on the way down. Nothing new about that though. The next room we come across contains a sort of gyroscope that appears to be containing an artificial gravity singularity. In order to deactivate the gravity, we have to stabilize the singularity, returning the room to its natural state of microgravity. While the exact operation of this device is probably indecipherable without sufficient knowledge of the unified field theory, it is an obvious reference to a similarly shaped machine in the movie Event Horizon, a movie which the developers of the first Dead Space surely took inspiration from. In fact, the whole setting and story of Dead Space 1 can probably be pretty well summarized as a combination of Alien and Event Horizon, and I would recommend it as a movie in spite of some obvious scientific inaccuracies. Curiously though, while we were trying to stabilize this gravitational singularity, the only cargo lift to access this room goes back up to the main floor, leaving you trapped down here to fend for yourself. I guess they just really want to make sure that whatever you start doing with the gravity system, you finish the job, but it's definitely not very sensible from a safety perspective.
Danger. Keep objects and personnel away from fan blades.
Well, of course, I wouldn't want to fly through those fan blades, except that the only other way up to the other level, the cargo lift, is still blocked off. So what else am I supposed to do here? Now that the coffin transportation system is back up and running, we can see that it operates in a similar manner to the trash chute we saw earlier, except in this case, a series of robotic arms are used to carefully align the coffin into the remaining part of the transportation system. Since the gravitational singularity generator is immediately below this central portion of the system, the coffins must be being sent out through the radial pipes that we see connecting to the center. In order for this to work, the coffins must then be rotated 90 degrees from the orientation in which they enter this transportation system, which is definitely not impossible, but it seems like the amount of space available for this rotation is pretty limited. And the fact that you already have robotic arms here aligning the coffins suggests that you could just use them to align the coffins to fit into these radial pipes. Also notable is how the coffin slows down before approaching the point at which the robotic arms grab onto it. The airflow from the fan could assist with this by slowing it down to a slow enough velocity that the robotic arms can grab it easily enough, or it could perhaps be done with magnets located around the port into which the coffin is about to enter, which acts as a sort of cushion to slow down the coffin as it approaches. At the top of this transportation system, we encounter what appears to be a partly automated coffin loading room, which is quite a sentence. One of the robotic arms in this room appears to be a little bit over-designed for its purpose of placing lids over top of coffins. There is a rack and pinion vertical drive system along the wall, and it appears to be an additional linear actuator system on the end effector where it can lower the cover independently of the placement of the robotic arm. So this arm has two different actuation systems for moving in a vertical direction. Now, while this is technically more than sufficient to move the lids in a vertical manner, one possible explanation for this could be that the vertical motion system on the end effector uses a higher precision linear actuation system, so that it can attach the lid to the coffin with more accuracy, and perhaps with just the proper amount of force. Now, putting a lid on a normal coffin probably wouldn't require this much delicacy, but considering that these are also cryogenic storage vessels, it does make some sense why they would want to make sure that they are sealed properly. Also in this room, we can see a scrolling information display that appears to be reading out the status of various components of the robotic arms. This scrolling behavior is not a very effective way to display this information if you need to be aware of the status of all parts of the system at once, since this way you'll have to wait until the relevant information comes back up on the screen again. After crawling through another maintenance duct to inspect the plumbing, we dramatically fall out into a storeroom of unitologist artifacts. Inside this room, we can see that the duct through which Isaac was crawling appears to be primarily intended for ventilation, based on its placement near the ceiling. There's also no other way to easily access this duct from the room in which we have fallen into, but it does further lend credence to the idea that these ducts are used to help cool electronic components. It could also be that the maintenance ducts themselves are also connected to ventilation ducts to provide sufficient airflow for people inside them to breathe. However, most of the ducts that we do go through in this game only have one entrance and exit. And with that being the case here, this remains a rather curious placement for a maintenance shaft. Making our way through a very quiet room and a somewhat uneventful elevator ride, we find our way up to the top floor of the Unitologist Church, where we find an observation room that looks out over the entirety of the sprawl. In addition to being a visual highlight and one of the best views in the game, it's also a very nicely done calm before the storm moment. The dust from the decades of mining away what remains of the once bountiful moon's crust creates an otherworldly, muddy, and organic scattering of dim sunlight over the metropolis below, once teeming with brave and optimistic life striving toward the promise of a future beyond Earth, but now harboring nothing but death. And with that, at this point we have effectively reached the end of Chapter 5 and the first act. And to avoid spoiling the story, I'll just say at this point that, as you probably could have guessed, things don't go according to plan. After a very well done action sequence, we find ourselves back in Cassini Towers, the residential space we encountered in Chapter 3, with a lot of Unitologist writings all over the walls and floors. And it seems like in the time since Chapter 3, they've gotten exactly what they wanted. Since we're effectively starting the second act of the story here, I'll include a few bits of dialogue to help explain where things are at now.
Isaac, are you there? Can you hear me?
What do you want, Strauss? Look, it's over. All my plans just blew out the window.
No, it's not over, at least not yet. Isaac, we build it. We can tear it down.
What, you mean the marker? Do you know where the marker is, Strauss?
It's in the government sector. The government sector, but we have to move now. Now. Because time is running out for me and for us.
Stross! Stross, where you going?
They were afraid of us after the sessions. I remember. They took us to the machine for our sessions, for the steps.
I don't remember any sessions.
You're lucky you don't remember. When you do, he starts coming back.
Who? Who comes back? Who?
Look at you. You've grown up so much. Where are you going?
Stross, don't follow. He's not really there.
Making our way over to the Hyperion Hall apartments, we can see a large fire that is blocking our path. However, the gravity has also failed in this room, which is a key point of unrealistic behavior of this fire. The reason that fire burns upwards is because of convection, as the heated products of the chemical reaction of fire are carried upwards by a buoyant force resulting from their heat. This convective buoyancy, though, depends on gravity to take effect. And in fact, in the absence of gravity, flames assume a circular shape, with a more evenly distributed temperature and thus a different and more uniform color. The physics of this is apparently pretty complex, and NASA has a whole experiment rack on the ISS dedicated to studying combustion in space. For our purposes, though, it should suffice to say that the fire that we see blocking this hallway is not what this would look like in real life.
Warning. Fire suppression system malfunction. Please manually deplete the oxygen supply to contain the fire.
I think I mentioned in most of my reviews so far how firefighting is done in space. And so far I've seen 3 different ways you can stop a space fire. The first approach is to displace the oxygen that the fire is burning. This can be done with a carbon dioxide-based fire extinguisher, which was historically used on the US orbital segment of the International Space Station. This does run the risk, though, of increasing the carbon dioxide concentration in an area too much, such that there wouldn't be enough oxygen available for astronauts to breathe. And so astronauts using these extinguishers would need to carry supplemental oxygen with them, which is in itself also a fire hazard. Another potentially safer way to do this is with a fine water mist. This approach is basically just dumping water on a fire, except that the water is dispersed in a form more suited for extinguishing a fire in space. This approach was historically used on all parts of the International Space Station. And going back to Titan Station, a third way of extinguishing fires could be to simply vent the atmosphere of the room. Now, if there's anybody left inside the room still, this is definitely not the best idea. There are also economic and logistic concerns related to dumping large amounts of atmosphere out into space. However, if the air could simply be pumped out of the room in a very timely manner into a holding tank, the fire could be extinguished with the air being returned to the room afterwards. The trick with this, though, would be to pump the air in and out in a fast enough manner to prevent damage while also not potentially introducing physiological effects from rapid changes in pressure. Now, the approach we see in-game is actually a little bit different than simply venting the atmosphere. By disabling the oxygen provision systems, we are effectively allowing the fire to consume all of the remaining oxygen in the room and burn itself out. At least nowadays, the pressurization system used in International Space Station, for example, does not use pure oxygen because this would pose an increased fire hazard, as seen during the Apollo 1 capsule fire. In this event, an electrical spark within the Apollo capsule quickly ignited the combustible nylon within the cabin, which rapidly spread due to the abundance of oxygen present. The crew were unable to open the door to the hatch, resulting in the deaths of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. There are a lot of engineering lessons learned and organizational implications from this event. So if you're interested in space history, there's a lot more to find on this topic. So instead of using pure oxygen for an atmosphere on board the space station, a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen similar to what is found in the atmosphere of Earth is used instead. Now, while you definitely wouldn't be able to breathe the remaining nitrogen in the room after the oxygen has all been burned up, this at least prevents the pressure from dropping as significantly as fully venting the room. And due to the lack of convection in the room resulting from a lack of gravity, the fire could burn out all of the oxygen within its vicinity, while still potentially leaving oxygen in other parts of the room. As the computer mentions, the automated fire suppression systems were offline at this point, so this method of fire extinguishing does seem like it could be a potentially effective backup approach. At least for this scenario given here, with fires in different locations throughout a large room. Oftentimes in video games, you encounter a blocked-off route with a convenient detour located right next to it. Now, while this is just a part of linear video game design, the inclusions of alternate routes to access important areas actually makes a lot of sense from an engineering and architecture perspective. If there's only one way into an important room and that way gets blocked, you could be in varying degrees of trouble. So having an alternative route is good design and makes a lot of sense.
Isaac, the steps. He wants me to follow the steps. Step 1, crawl into the dark machine.
Strauss, calm down. He can't hurt you.
He wants me to go into the dark machine, Isaac. I can't go. She's in there. She's waiting for me.
Strauss!
Oh God, oh God, oh God.
Strauss, listen to me. You need to keep moving. Can you get to the train? Can you do that?
He's coming. Can't talk.
After this detour, we find ourselves in a cargo storage room, similar to one we saw earlier in the game in Cassini Towers. If the primary goal with the layout of these crates was good level design, then I think they did a pretty good job here. But if the goal was efficient product stacking, this probably could have been done much more effectively. Also within this cargo bay, we see one of these posters featuring a manual riveter. And once again, compared to the crazy tools we get to use in this game, this seems like a curious way to illustrate this point. But at least makes more sense without the laser coming out of it like we saw in the Dead Space remake. Also within this cargo bay, we come across this calibration sticker stuck onto the wall, seemingly nowhere near any system that would require calibration. Now, a generous explanation could be that they required random testing of random spots on the station primary structure to ensure that it's still holding up, but I think there's another possible explanation that might fit in with the setting a bit better. Throughout the game, we've seen a lot of these calibration and inspection stickers placed on various locations without much care given to what they're actually placed on. Ignoring the reused texture of the inspection reports, this may suggest that these stickers are simply being placed wherever necessary to give the impression that the machine has been calibrated or inspected, without needing to actually do the work. With a station this size, if anybody were to actually notice one of these stickers being applied incorrectly, there would be a whole lot of bureaucracy to go through before they could actually get resolution to it, which would probably make it difficult to track down the person responsible, or at least not in a timely manner. If true, this level of complacency would be extremely dangerous for such a complex system as a space station of this size, but would at least be in keeping with the theme throughout the series of cutting corners and costs wherever possible.
Whoa, hey, hey!
No. You stay back. You want to talk? You talk from there.
Don't say you're gonna help. The last person who said that tried to kill me.
Hey, take it easy. I'm not gonna hurt you.
Yeah, you got that right. You try it, and you're dead.
Look, I think we got off to a bad start here. I'm Isaac.
Ellie. What do you want, Isaac?
I'm trying to get to the transport hub. I need to get to the government sector.
What do you think we were trying to do?
Hey, I can help you. Besides, we got a better chance if we stick together. Don't you agree?
It's not a chance, Isaac. Other people are just a liability. I'll release the door lock. But after that, you're on your own. And please, don't follow me, okay?
Wait.
After this encounter, we finally get to access the security suit. Or at least I did, since I kept running out of ammo beforehand. In addition to armor, this suit features a lot of padding, presumably to absorb blows that the user might receive in the line of duty. However, this shock-absorbing material could perhaps be effective if you are going to be operating in a microgravity environment where you might expect to bump into the walls occasionally, or have floating objects around that might impact you. And where the armor might be effective at preventing puncturing of the suit, the shock-absorbing material could be effective at preventing injuries from blunt force. One potential issue with the design, though, is that, like the security suits we saw in Alien Isolation, the Dead Space security suit also leaves the femoral artery mostly unprotected, which is a major weak point in human physiology. So if you're going to be adding weight due to armor anyways, you might as well add some more to the upper legs. The helmet of the security suit is also shaped in such a way as to more effectively deflect incoming projectiles. And so an impacting bullet, for example, might be more likely to glance off the shield than a flatter surface such as the faceplate of the engineering suit. At this point, we come across one of the more disturbing sections of this game, the Titan Station Elementary School. Now, I won't show anything graphic here, but if you do want to skip this section for any reason, you can go to the timestamp on screen. There are several poster boards throughout the school documenting students' favorite things that they did during this past year. One of them mentions a field trip to the EarthGov Research Center, where Isaac is currently trying to get to destroy a marker. As we'll come to find out, the EarthGov sector is a very high security portion of the station, making it rather curious that young students would be allowed inside. Although based on what we've seen so far, it wouldn't surprise me if this wasn't actually just a field trip. Also within the school, we can find a few posters for a stage play of The Metamorphosis, a very popular novel by Franz Kafka in the 20th century. Now, since I can only read books with numbers, I am not familiar with the story other than the Wikipedia summary, but the story does at least superficially bear some resemblance to the sorts of things that have been happening in Dead Space. And perhaps it's just this added context that makes me think this, but it also seems like a curious choice to put on as a school stage production. There's yet another poster here for a space camping expedition, promising 20 hours of moonwalking over the course of a week. This level of space accessibility is clearly beyond the technological capabilities of the modern day, and especially to do this in a way that's accessible for kids, you would want to have extremely high reliability space systems in place, which based on what we've seen so far does not seem to be the case. Throughout the school we can find a lot of these cabinets along the hallways, some of which are built into the wall and some of which seem like they could be aftermarket components. The main thing to point out, though, is that they are proportionately sized to the children who would be using them. There's a small globe near the entryway here that gives us a bit of an idea of what the borders of the countries on Earth are like at this point in time. Curiously, America and Russia seem to be indicated with a blue color that just barely differs from the ocean, but Canada and Latin and South America are still marked in green, which makes me think this isn't related to sea levels rising. There also seem to be a lot more borders indicated in Eastern Asia and Eurasia, again, many of which are using the blue background as well. It's also kind of hard to tell where exactly the western part of Europe is listed on this map, since identifying Scandinavia with this low-resolution texture is kind of tricky. In any case, though, it does still appear that there are oceans present on Earth, which is a point we will revisit shortly. On another school poster, we can see several math equations that apparently indicate what the children are learning in school. One of these is Newton's second law, but written in differential form, which is something you typically wouldn't see until calculus. It's possible this may be a very deep-cut reference to a Star Trek Voyager episode, in which one of the parents tells his young child to go and study his calculus homework. I don't remember what episode that was, but if you do, please let me know. From an efficiency perspective, I really like this idea of having all the furniture and stage props just fold back into the floor so you can reconfigure the gymnasium. In order to accomplish this, though, basically everything would have to be designed with a very modular approach in mind. But this does still fit the over-engineering theme of mechanisms throughout the Dead Space series. On another poster in one of the hallways, we can see a drawing of the solar system. There are a few curiosities of note here. For one, Earth is depicted as green and brown with a little bit of blue, perhaps suggesting that either the oceans have been highly polluted, or that they are actually starting to dry up. Either way, this is in contrast with the blue Earth that we've seen in some occasional posters throughout the game so far. Speaking of which, Venus is depicted as a very blue planet here, which could suggest that it has been heavily terraformed. Now, this isn't a new idea in science fiction. In fact, there's a whole Wikipedia page on it. And one big potential draw of this is that Venus is very similar in many aspects to Earth, aside from its hellish atmosphere. So if planetary engineering operations could be conducted there to a great enough extent, this could perhaps provide a third off-world home for humanity besides Mars, which in this drawing is still shown as red without any traces of green or blue, suggesting that Martian terraforming has not been as effective as on Venus. Other than those few points, everything looks fine about this solar system map, except for the fact that Pluto is still not included here. Yes, I know Pluto is a dwarf planet, we talked about this in Infinite Warfare, but Pluto is still a planet to me, dang it. Even if the IAU disagrees. We're getting off track though. Yes, technically it is a dwarf planet, I'll shut up. Inside one of the classrooms, we can find on several bookshelves various books regarding unitology. This is in contradiction to a line that Dana said when we first entered the Church of Unitology back in Chapter 4.
Dana, the Church of Unitology? Why here?
It's one of the few places on Titan Station that Tideman can't monitor. Separation of church and state.
To be fair, Dana turned out to not be the most reliable source of information, and it could also be that this is a privately funded school that is not supported by EarthGov, though this seems unlikely given the amount of cooperation that would be required to establish such a school as this on board a densely populated and heavily controlled space station such as the Sprawl. But aside from that, I'm not really sure what a good explanation of this would be other than just developer oversight. I have no really good ideas for why the schematic for a flamethrower is located in a classroom, but I suppose you could say in a roundabout way that it could be a reference to the movie Aliens. Alternatively, the only other thing I could think of was perhaps it could be a reference to the fire in a can bit in Parks and Recreation. As of today, humanity's still limited experience living off-planet has shown that there are many psychological impacts of being away from Earth for an extended period of time. Even remaining on the planet and being away from civilization can also have psychological ramifications. And in these cases, we're dealing with full-grown adults, so I can only imagine how difficult it would be for children to grow up on a space station, especially one in which the most exposure they have to large open areas is a playground room with the walls painted blue and the floor painted green. Mars may not be the kind of place to raise your kids, but unless they're specifically built for it, space stations seem like they could be a lot worse.
Isaac! We're up here! Come on, move!
Hello, Isaac.
Well, this brings up bad memories. I barely managed to escape the CEC facility this morning.
Wait, you're CEC?
Heavy equipment pilot, class 4. You?
Engineer.
Nerd.
Okay, well that's accurate, but that's also kind of a 2010 bit of dialogue there. Inside this transport hub, we can see another timetable for trams departing this terminal. These are all the same destinations as we saw during Chapter 2, but now most of the lines are showing delayed rather than cancelled, suggesting that the automated systems are somehow coming back online. There's also the addition of a beta line traveling to the Concourse District Central Station. And if nothing else, it's at least nice to see that the developers didn't just simply reuse the asset they already had here. As someone pointed out in the comments to my review of the first Dead Space game, in a future like this you would expect to see a lot more robotic operators performing tasks that are otherwise unsuited for humans. However, there are almost no robots that we see throughout the entire Dead Space series, meaning that humans must still be responsible for doing all the dull, repetitive, and dangerous tasks that robotics could take over in the future. This could then be a way to provide the large population of Earth a steady supply of jobs. Now this poster says that EarthGov is providing 30,000 jobs, which are ostensibly intended to support the economy. It doesn't say that all 30,000 of these jobs are located on Titan Station or Earth or spread across the solar system or other human-controlled systems. The way it's written kind of implies that this is supposed to be on Titan Station, and if so, this would mean that Titan Station is capable of supporting at least 30,000 people, probably more since not everybody would be working for EarthGov, which is a massive feat of space engineering to house this many people on board a single space station. If this spiky metal fixture serves no purposes other than artistic ones, this really says a lot about the state of the station as a whole, and probably art as well, which I guess you could say is the point of it as an art piece. We're getting too far into the weeds with that. Instead of this complex mechanism to seal off a hallway that has a pinch hazard, perhaps a simple solid door might have sufficed, or at least some sort of mechanism with less proclivity to amputation. Now, to be fair to the point about the lack of inclusion of stairs throughout this game, the way these sloped modules are designed suggests that they can be attached to other modules with a standard bulkhead connection. But since they appear to have fixed dimensions, you would only really be able to use them effectively if the floor plan or available envelope of space allows you to install these rooms in this manner. Basically, if there's not enough space for these ramps to fit around existing station equipment, you might not be able to build the station with them effectively. And finally, to conclude this rather dense chapter, I'll play a few bits of dialogue here that will explain how the story is progressing into the next chapter.
Our two remaining runners, Clark and Strauss. I knew it was only a matter of time before you reached the transit hub. You would find the train inoperable.
Are you insane? You cut off power to life support. There may be other survivors over here.
Public sector is already beyond acceptable recovery conditions. I can't allow you to escape. Goodbye, Clark.
Ellie, do you know what a marker is?
Yeah. The unitologist on my crew wouldn't shut up about it. Why, is it real?
Yeah, it's real. Tideman made one using codes, patterns stored in our heads, mine and Strauss. Everything that's happening on this station is happening because of that marker. I have to get to it and destroy it, and I need Strauss to tell me how.
You're a strange man, Isaac.
Will you help me?
We're about to suffocate, so I think I'm better.
Okay, good. Listen, we need power. Without it, we have no air and no train. Sprawl's gotta have backup batteries somewhere.
Yes. The solar array's up there. But they've been mothballed for years.
Okay, alright, good. I'm heading there now. If I can start them up and get some power to the train.
You'll need someone to open the collector panels. I can do that.
Take Strauss and keep him safe. Ellie! How's Strauss doing?
With power off. You can hear noises 3 blocks away. He's gonna give away my position.
Ellie, try to keep him focused. I need to know what he's trying to tell me.
The two will go tight.
On our way to the solar panels, we pass through a power distribution room. This would make sense to have here for a traditional solar panel array, but as we'll see shortly, this is not really the case here. In any case though, if these cables are very high power, at the very least they're placed just out of reach of people on the other side of this railing, but they probably could have been isolated just a little bit better, I think. There's also a rather curious fixture along the walls in this room, in which a couple of boxes are wired to some sort of implement that is attached to the floor. This implement, though, doesn't really have any features on it, and so it seems to act as some sort of grounding point. Judging by the size of these cables, the only logical conclusion I could make here was that this fixture is designed to safely ground very large power spikes. However, if it's meant to do this though, it could probably have been done much more simply by simply having the panel boxes grounded to the primary structure itself, rather than using cables to connect to another spot. Yes, I know this is really a nitpick, but it's something that kind of stood out to me. Also in this room we can see several very large cable harnesses, some of which are connected between the floor and ceiling, and some of which are connected between 2 points on a wall. In the case of the cables connecting the floor and ceiling, the bend makes sense here so that the cables would have a bit of give in them so that they could account for any displacements that occur within the primary structure. For the smaller loops that are connecting between 2 points on the wall though, they are connecting with very small bend radii. And especially for high voltage cables like this, there's a minimum bend radius to each cable that you want to maintain to prevent the cable from wearing out or shorting. Now these are bundles of smaller cables, so there might be a little bit of leeway there, as opposed to a large cable that was the diameter of the full bundle.
Ellie, I ran into a snag. It looks like the docking pod that runs to the solar array is floating at the bottom of the shaft.
That figures.
Don't worry, I can fix this. I'm heading outside to have a look.
This intermediate room before the elevator maintenance bay has a much more effective implementation of forced airflow for a microgravity environment than we usually see throughout the station. Granted, it is probably a bit overkill to have this many vents, but this combined with the graded floor means that there will be effective airflow throughout this room, preventing buildup of carbon dioxide and also providing cooling for these cables. The thrust canisters we're introduced to in this scene are a very interesting application of rocket technology for moving objects in microgravity. Now remember, just because there's no gravity doesn't mean that objects lose their mass, and thus their inertia. So for a large mass of objects, you're going to need to apply a large force in order to move them effectively, which is where these rockets come in. Using several legs, probably magnetic, to attach onto the object you want to move, and then a sort of blast cap that ignites the full rocket engine once the cap is destroyed. Based on the behavior of these rockets, we can say that they're most likely solid rocket motors, since they simply appear to burn continuously until the onboard fuel is expended. Solid rocket motors are also the perfect application for this because they're much easier to ignite and control than something like a liquid rocket engine. For basic applications such as this, you could probably do something as simple as a cylindrical grain, or slab effectively, of rocket fuel that burns starting from the nozzle end. Shooting the blast cap at the end of the nozzle could then provide the spark to start the propellant grain burning. If we look closely at these thrust canisters though, there does appear to be a bit more mechanism to it than a simple solid rocket motor would need. So if we wanted to get fancy with this, we could suppose that it's using some sort of hypergolic propellant mixture, which is a combination of chemicals that spontaneously ignite once they come into contact with each other. So for example, the blast cap could simply be a basic cap, and then once removed, the hypergolic fuel inside spontaneously combusts with the oxygen in the room. As you might expect though, hypergolic propellants are much more difficult to control and safely handle than solid rocket motors. So a hypergolic implementation would probably be a lot less safe than a solid rocket motor. However, depending on the chemicals involved, you may be able to get a more effective burn out of a hypergolic propellant than a solid. And you may also be able to control the burn more effectively, since stopping and restarting a solid rocket motor is relatively quite difficult. With a better view of Saturn's rings here, we can take a bit better look at their structure. Once again, the angle at which we're viewing them is most likely unrealistic, unless Titan's orbit has been changed significantly to give it a higher inclination. However, compared to observations of Saturn's rings, it appears that most of the major features are present here. Keeping in mind the different lighting conditions, we can see what appears to be the Huygens gap and Cassini division, as well as the Encke gap on the outer edge of the rings. It almost also appears that they have the Keeler gap included as well. However, the F ring itself appears to not be present. And it's a little harder to tell, but it does appear that the Colombo and Maxwell gaps are still present, although their spacing seems a little bit off. Now, this being 500 years into the future, and where the space mining industry has become quite prevalent throughout human-occupied space, I would almost expect the rings to not match up with what they are today, since they contain a large amount of water, which, as previously mentioned, is going to be very valuable in the outer solar system. Because the solar array is physically separated from the rest of Titan Station, a sort of shuttle is used to travel between the two. At least within this holding compartment, the shuttle motion appears to be guided by a set of gravity tethers. Their configuration suggests that they operate in a manner similar to modern-day maglev systems, except in this case the levitation is accomplished through gravitational forces rather than electromagnetic. Notably, the height in the room at which the shuttle comes to rest for users to embark or disembark is a considerable distance away from the room's floor. This suggests that in addition to using these gravity tethers to propel the shuttle upwards, they are also used to catch it on its way down and then gradually slow its velocity, perhaps in a manner not unsimilar to an arresting gear on an aircraft carrier. At the base of the shuttle, we can see what appear to be support struts that are intended to absorb the shock of the shuttle coming to rest at the Titan Station to allow the shuttle to more safely and effectively come to a complete stop on its way down. And these landing legs could be used to absorb some of the shock as it impacts, in a controlled manner, the lower level primary structure.
Ellie, I've got the elevator repaired. I'm heading up to the array.
Fortunately for a vehicle traveling through the vacuum, there are blast doors on these windows, but unfortunately they don't activate until we've reached the solar array. So somebody should probably take a look at those vacuum sensors.
To solar array Sigma 055. Proper identification is required. Please wait here. Watchman Howard Phillips will be with you shortly.
As we come to find out in this level, this solar array separate from the station, when it was operational, was overseen by a single individual, along with a sort of AI assistant, one might say. Now, on the one hand, having only one operator of the entire solar array suggests that it is designed to be operated with such high reliability that any small problems can be corrected by a single operator. Or perhaps over time, as the solar array became more of an auxiliary supply of power, maintenance was less of a priority, and thus the station delegated minimum resources towards it. The latter option seems more likely, as some of the logs in this level indicate that the operator's requests for additional resources went unanswered, or were potentially blocked from being sent by the AI. On that note, it's interesting to see how this AI assistant is presented in this game, as this was well before the advent of GPT-based chatbots. Now, it is possible that in this universe such advanced chatbots exist, but that this is essentially a pared-down version that is designed for minimal functionality only. Basically an instance of the station administration getting the cheapest model possible. It's also interesting to note that this AI assistant appears, at least in part, to be intended to help the lone operator and alleviate psychological issues of loneliness. At a conceptual level, there is some basis in modern technology to support this as an actual use case. However, at least in part based on my own experiences with AI, in order for this to work, you're probably going to need a more advanced model than a Siri-level intelligence, and perhaps even more capable than modern-day GPT chatbots. The AI also appears to use these hologram projectors to move throughout the station to match the location of its operator, which is not creepy at all. Perhaps even more helpful for the operator than the AI are his birds. I'm not enough of an ornithologist to identify the specific type of bird here, but I'm sure somebody can. And while they don't have a large open area to fly in, they at least have more volume than the typical American apartment. I didn't really find a whole lot of information on birds that have gone to space in the past, except for one pretty informative personal site that I will include the link to here. And most of the avian population that has been to space were Japanese quails, which apparently were originally intended as a potential sustainable food source. This was also done by the Soviets, if you couldn't guess. And it does seem that as long as there is air present in microgravity, birds are technically able to maneuver themselves, or at least they try to do so. With the presence of artificial gravity here, though, I imagine that the bird's development would be pretty normal, at least from a physiological perspective. I'm sure the space environment is probably not optimal to the birds themselves. Again, I'm not an expert though, so feel free to correct me in the comments. Inside the somewhat ambiguously labeled power grid room, we can find 8 labeled power junction boxes. Each of these boxes is connected with 4 large cables. These large cables appear to be connected in parallel to another set of 3 smaller boxes, which route into the wall in some way or another. Now, based on the number of cables we can see here, I suspect that this system would be utilizing 3-phase alternating current power. And as I mentioned, since I'm not an electrical engineer, my knowledge of AC circuits is somewhat limited. However, this method of delivering power is more effective over long distances, and so perhaps could be more effective at efficiently distributing power over a large structure such as the one we see in this solar array. Inside the computer mainframe room, we can see that there is a large amount of air cooling equipment along some of the walls of the room, but not immediately adjacent to the substation primary computer. Looking closely, it appears that these may be fans that are exhausting heat away from a radiator for the computer's active liquid cooling loop. For a high reliability computer such as this, it definitely makes sense you would want to be able to maintain effective cooling even in the event that gravity were to fail. And so having forced convection over the radiators would be an effective way of doing this. However, eventually this solar array substation itself would increase in temperature as a whole, and so at that point, unless the primary structure of the substation itself is capable of emitting enough heat away into space as radiation, you may still need additional supplemental radiation panels, such as those seen on modern and historical space stations.
Unauthorized visitor. Mainframe.
Computer, this is Director Titan. Disable all solar array functions immediately.
Initiating system lockdown. System lockdown complete.
I'm sorry, Clark. I know what you're trying to do, and I cannot allow you to succeed. There's too much at stake.
Inside the mainframe room, there is a maintenance shaft that connects to 2 computer node cluster rooms, for lack of a better word. Inside this maintenance shaft, the walls and ceiling are lined with these green conical things. Based on the bleep and bloop sound effects that are coming from them that are typically reminiscent of 20th century computer operations, we could perhaps suppose that these are replaceable compute nodes that are designed in such a way as to fit inside this cooling duct and can be easily replaced if one of them were to burn out. Essentially, this could be like having a large number of tensor processing units lining your air conditioning duct, except that the duct is large enough to crawl inside and may start without warning, so be cautious. The high degree of shielding around the computer mainframe, in addition to the many levels of security required to access it, as well as the large amount of cooling we see here, lead me to believe that this could be a quantum computer that is operating the solar power generation systems and the artificial intelligence. The shielding on this computer system would be necessary to prevent random cosmic rays from interfering and accidentally flipping quantum bits, or qubits. Now, quantum computing is a pretty intricate field that is rather out of my realm of specialization, and it is still rather theoretical since modern implementations of this technology are still rather limited and experimental in nature. Notably though, at least modern qubits are much more susceptible to interference from outside sources, thus they must be kept isolated from the outside world as best as possible. And so often they are supercooled to very close to absolute zero. As these quantum systems are likely to remain quite fragile even into the far future, at least based on insights from modern technology, the highly complex mainframe nodes that we can finally access after disabling security systems at least suggest that this is an implementation of quantum computing. However, I'm not sure why the radiation hazard signs are present on these computing modules, and at this stage of the game I wouldn't really be surprised if they were just put there to deter intruders.
Offline. Lockouts. Offline. Station reverted to manual operation only. Offline.
To access the solar panel array, there is an additional lift outside the station that takes you up into the central region of the solar panel focusing system. Essentially, this elevator itself functions as the airlock for performing maintenance spacewalks. Of the 6 solar panels on the exterior, 3 of them appear to function as partial mirrors, reflecting some of the sunlight back towards 3 central solar panels. At least with modern technology, solar panels are very inefficient, and the majority of the light that they receive is actually not converted into electricity. This is essentially a known limitation of the technology, and as of recording, the highest efficiency managed by a solar power cell is just under 50% in lab conditions. So in addition to using solely photovoltaic energy production systems, large numbers of solar panels can be combined to produce a concentrated solar power generation system. In these setups, the light from the solar panels is reflected onto a collector, which is used to heat up a working fluid that can be used to drive a generator of some kind with an efficiency that potentially can surpass that of solar panels alone. This, of course, does require a very large number of solar panels, or at least a large surface area of solar panels, so they're not very common today on Earth. As far as the concentrated solar power system we see in Dead Space 2, the system could use the partial mirror reflectors to allow some sunlight to be absorbed by the photovoltaic cells, and then reflecting and concentrating the light towards the central panels, which operate as a solar thermal energy generation system. Now, whether or not this would actually be economically sensible to construct depends on the efficiency of the solar panels themselves and whether or not you would get better efficiency out of a concentrated solar power system. And so while there's probably too many variables to go into here, it is worth noting that the solar array was given an alphanumeric designator when we first arrived, suggesting that at least at one point there were multiple of these solar arrays to power the station. So perhaps additional of these solar substations could have been used to concentrate sunlight onto a larger collector, which could perhaps lead to increased efficiency and output that would make sense to construct multiple iterations of these large substations. The solar station also uses what can only generously be described as a laser power delivery system to transmit power from the solar substation to Titan Station below. The system essentially uses a laser beam to transmit power over long distances without requiring a physical connection and also without suffering the losses that would accompany one. The downside of this is that using a photovoltaic cell as a receiver would also potentially suffer from efficiency challenges. Interestingly though, the fact that we can see the solar beam here is likely due to the large amounts of dust that are still present in the vicinity of the remains of Titan. This would actually make a lot of sense as to why you would want to move the solar station far away from the core, since the dust would reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the solar panels and thus reduce the amount of energy that they can produce. So having the solar power generation system farther away from Titan's core, out of the densest part of the dust cloud, would improve the efficiency of the solar power generation system while sacrificing a small amount of the power transmitted by the laser system. From this vantage point, we also get an excellent view of the entirety of the sprawl seen from above. Like some kind of twisted overview effect, suspended in the dusty vacuum of the remains of the Saturnian moon that once brought it life, the city hangs from the remnant core as we look on with cautious breath at the dying husk of the outer planet colony, at once subsumed by the extinction of the life it once held, and yet also having never held a full and proper life even at its zenith.
Exiting zero gravity.
Ellie, come in!
Isaac! We have to cross to the government sector before they cut us off. You'll never make it down here in time.
I'll be there!
And finally, to conclude this chapter, we get probably one of the most impractical yet awesome machines in the entire series. This ejector seat is reminiscent of the rocket sleds that NASA used to test just how high of a G-force a human could survive. And I suppose if you really needed to get somewhere quickly, and weren't really particularly concerned about the physiological effects of high G-forces, this would be an effective way to get from point A to point B, assuming that point B has an actual landing site. As we open up this chapter, we have been forced to divert into the CEC factory on board Titan Station, where we are quickly reacquainted with the industrial aesthetic and total lack of safety culture that we saw on the USG Ishimura. Just a quick heads up, I had a bit of a sinus infection while recording these next couple chapters, so if I sound different, that's why. Inside the factory control room, we can see a holographic display of what appears to be the entire factory. Now, since planet cracking of Titan was one of the reasons for the station's construction in the first place, it makes perfect sense that the CEC would have such a large presence here as to warrant such a large amount of volume on the limited space of Titan Station. There are two obvious different levels in the factory hologram that suggest that the station superstructure is divided in such a way as that there are perhaps multiple planes on which station infrastructure can be built. We could perhaps extrapolate from this that one of these layers was the original superstructure of Titan Station, with a whole other layer built on top of it, or beneath it. For a station this size that's been only around for about 70 years, this would seem a very massive feat of engineering, but it's also worth remembering that the Ishimura was built in only 3 years. so perhaps the scale of manufacturing in this universe is sufficient to enable another massive construction project like this. Inside the CEC records room, we can see that the primary terminal has been wired up to several server racks on the floor. The fact that the cables are just strewn across the floor and not within the walls suggests this is an aftermarket upgrade of some kind, such as, for example, the servers being installed to handle a surge in computational load due to an unexpected economic incident. In any case, though, the servers don't appear to be bolted down to the floor or attached by any sort of dedicated mounting system. That, combined with the poor cable management, to put it lightly, suggests that this is more of a rush job. We can also see in this room, though, that at least to some extent, the CEC is still maintaining paper records, which, while perhaps cumbersome, at least allows them to have a backup in case of a computer failure. Some of these servers seem to have different sorts of binary displays on them. I can't be sure if these are actual binary displays or if it's just blinking lights to give the impression, but I did see a few computer engineers analyzing these lights in my last video, so if this means anything to you, feel free to leave a comment. The sparking cubes that we can find in this one hallway seem to resemble transformer coils, which are used to convert between different circuits using different voltages. Once again, they also appear to be alternating current circuits due to the 3 wires. Assumedly, these transformer coils would be kept in such an accessible place, with the idea of them being easily replaceable if they were to burn out, suggesting that these are either very high power circuits and or that they are very high reliability circuits that need to be kept online as much as possible. Either way though, having a high voltage transformer coil almost completely exposed to the walkable area of a hallway seems like kind of a bad idea. And I don't even have to be an electrical engineer to know that. Immediately after this high voltage hallway, we have to cross over a catwalk that goes across a fluid storage room. We can tell from the condensation dripping from the overhead pipes that these pipes are carrying cryogenic fluids. When you want to store a large amount of gas for a long period of time, it makes sense to liquefy it first, so we can suppose that these tanks here are intended for cryogenic storage. However, on some of these tanks we can also see stickers warning of hot metal, which would be the opposite of the actual hazard. There's also a hazardous voltage warning on one side of the bridge, which on one hand is a little bit odd considering this is a cryogenic storage facility, but also that there's not really any place where you could actually reach from this bridge that you could potentially shock yourself. Unless it's referring to these hanging cables, in which case that's a very bad sign. On the topic of cables, a little fun fact for anybody who is interested in more advanced math topics. The shape of a hanging cable is not defined by the common parabola function. Instead, it's its own thing called a catenary curve, which is defined by the hyperbolic cosine, or cosine as I always said it in school. It doesn't really make a whole lot of difference here with just these set dressing cables, but if I had to learn the derivation of this equation, I figured I'd at least tell somebody about it.
The door is jammed. This must have been the last stand for whoever was left down here.
Can you get the door open on your end?
No, the circuits are fried. They must have fused the panel trying to keep those things out.
There's gotta be another way in.
The only other way is through the processing plant. But it's not meant for human traffic.
Step boy.
I think I can stop it from here, though.
Alright, do it.
In addition to the obvious floor plan issue of not having a backup route into this room, the fact that these power doors are configured in such a way that they are forced shut when the power is disabled would definitely be a hazard to anybody who needs to escape from a dangerous situation where the power is out. It is possible that this power malfunction is not a power outage and that some circuits have just been overheated or overloaded, and the door is essentially just broken at this point. Ideally, in a more dangerous part of the station such as this, the door locking mechanisms would disable themselves while the power is out, but still remaining sealed while the power is out to maintain the air within the room. The pressurization control room has a large number of mechanisms that appear to be primarily intended to present a heavily industrial atmosphere, more so than making much mechanical sense. Before getting to the machines though, notably right as we enter the room there are 2 support beams that have radioactivity warning stickers on them, which implies that the materials used to construct these beams were somewhat radioactive. This is pretty obviously not a good idea, especially when you're already having quite a lot of space radiation to deal with here. But almost equally concerning is the fact that we only see these stickers in this particular instance of these support beams. And so if whatever this radioactive material is used in other parts of the station, then we're going to have even more problems. Once the machines in the room start up, we can get a little bit more idea of what they're supposed to be doing. These piston mechanisms hanging from the ceiling tanks appear to be using the expansion of the gas within the tank to extend the piston. The gas inside the piston is then vented out through these diaphragms and creates the mist that we see expelled from them. So presumably then, these mechanisms are being used to relieve the pressure inside these tanks in a more controlled manner than a simple relief valve. I suppose it could be possible that by more slowly diffusing the gas into the atmosphere, it is less hazardous than just simply opening up a valve, which could perhaps be related to the mist that forms. But other than that, I'm not really sure what the purpose behind this overly complex mechanism could be. On the tanks on the floor, we see some sort of lever arms that are repeatedly actuating and nearly impacting the tank's upper surface. We can also see on some of the tanks up on the walls that they appear to be held in place by similar looking arms. The purpose of these mechanisms is much less evident to me. My first guess would be that perhaps they are there to break up any ice that forms on the upper surface of these tanks due to the mist that's being released right on top of them. Or alternatively, that when they're all fully actuated, they can hold this tank or outer mechanism in place with minimal contact points, perhaps to reduce heat transfer or electrical conduction. Other than that, I don't really have a good explanation for these piano arms. Now, these strange mechanisms make it a little difficult to guess at what the purpose of this room would be, but based on the pressure relief pistons for the upper tanks, we could suppose that this is perhaps a way of exhausting chemical reaction byproducts in a safe manner, at least in a mechanically safe manner. If you're exhausting chemical byproducts into an atmosphere where people are breathing it, it's probably not a good idea. In this next room, we can see what appear to be canisters in the walls that contain a substance that is marked as combustible and radioactive. A likely candidate for this could be tritium, which is a relatively rare isotope of hydrogen that can be used in nuclear fusion reactions, among other more nefarious purposes. Tritium glows with a characteristic nuclear color that make it pretty recognizable, but as mentioned, it is very rare compared to the more common deuterium, which is another more cosmically abundant isotope of hydrogen that can also be used in nuclear fusion reactions, albeit less effectively. The point being that if the CEC is actually managing to acquire tanks full of tritium at any one point in time, they probably have a pretty refined industrial process for manufacturing it, and an optimistic interpretation of this could be that they will have plenty of fuel for the Titan Station nuclear fusion reactors. This could also perhaps explain the radioactive stickers we saw in the previous room, wherein if tritium or a similar radioactive substance is being transported through this area, it could perhaps contribute to radioactivation of the steel in the beams, which basically means that the steel is made radioactive. Although this has the somewhat worrying consequence of implying that the mist being released into the room is a form of tritiated water, with 2 tritium atoms instead of protium or hydrogen atoms, which, as previously mentioned, is probably not good to breathe in large quantities.
I think I've hit a dead end. Looks like some kind of venting system up ahead.
Right. Manually shutting down the plant froze all the pressure valves in place. You'll need to find a way to force it open.
Now, assuming that this large door is one of the pressure valves that Ellie mentioned, this door is somewhat similar to an airflow damper that you might see in air ducts, which are in essence valves for controlling airflow. This room could essentially act as a lower pressure buffer, such that when the air pressure on the opposite side gets too high, it slightly opens the damper and allows the higher pressure air into this room to partially equalize. Then once the pressures have equalized, the shutter closes, and the smaller room can be vented out in a more controlled manner. And as we'll come to see, there's a lot of machinery on the other side that could easily heat up the temperature and thus increase the pressure on the other side of this shutter. Now, as we discussed in the Alien Isolation review, any space station large enough for it to be considered a space city is going to need a massive amount of power to sustain itself. Many of the energy generation methods we use on Earth today are not really available in space, such as wind power, for example, but also combustion reactions which would require oxygen, which is also a valuable resource in space. The 2 top contenders then for powering a massive space station would be solar and nuclear power. Now, as previously discussed, solar cells, at least today, are still quite inefficient, and you would need a massive amount of them to get a significant power output that could actually be useful for this situation. Thus, nuclear power is most likely going to be the only effective way to actually power a space city in the future. And while nuclear fission reactions are probably more than capable of doing that to some scale, a nuclear fusion generator, combined with a continuous supply of fuel, could be a massive uplift over nuclear fission generation systems. Major hurdles to this, of course, are being able to contain a nuclear fusion reaction and the steady fuel supply. Now, I've mentioned this in most of my previous reviews, but the atmospheres of the outer planets do contain fair amounts of deuterium, which is a fairly effective nuclear fusion fuel. So especially for a human settlement in the outer solar system, nuclear fusion offers a very promising means of powering such habitations. Again, though, for something the scale of Titan Station, a massive amount of fuel is going to be required. And so it appears at this stage of the game that we have come across the nuclear fusion fuel storage for the Titan Station reactors, hence the numerous radiation warning signs and the name hydrogen processing.
There,
powered off the facility. Remind me to thank her for providing me with your location. I've locked the processing cycle on, and you in with it. It ends here, Clark.
It doesn't have to be this way, Titan.
It does, and it is. Goodbye, Clark.
Not to worry, Director Tideman, this only gives us a better opportunity to investigate the hydrogen processing plant. The first machinery that we encounter, these rotary shafts, have what appear to be fan blades in a similar shape to what you might see on a vertical axis wind turbine. I suppose it could be possible that these are used to extract some electrical power from the motion of the air out towards the ventilation system that we just entered through, but I would think more likely is that these fan blades are included to reduce the air resistance on these shafts as they're spinning within an atmosphere, as opposed to ventilating this room completely, which would completely avoid air resistance, but would also prevent cooling from forced convection. This next system we come across appears to be a method of burning off impurities from source gases and collecting the exhausts into another pipeline. Now, the white color of these flames could either indicate one of two different things. Normally, one of the primary factors for determining the color of a flame is its black body temperature. Very briefly, this is basically an equation that determines the primary colors of light that will be emitted from an object based on its temperature. As you're probably aware, flames commonly burn with a more orange or red color, and higher temperature fires can sometimes burn with blue flames. White flames would be the next step up after blue, which would suggest that this is an extremely hot flame, which is not hard to believe. The other thing to consider for flame colors, though, is the introduction of additives into the combustion material. You may have seen this in flame tests, where by burning different elements you can get different color flames based on whatever you've added to the fire. From what I can find, most of the elements that will produce a white flame are metals, which would already need to be at a very high temperature to be in a gaseous form in the first place. So instead we could perhaps suppose that these combustors are burning off impurities from ore samples extracted from Titan. If we want to get really theoretical, we could perhaps suppose that the distance over which the flame is burning could separate the different compounds within the flame based on the speed at which the particles travel through the air, allowing them to be filtered out at the exhaust port. There would be quite a lot of science that would go into actually implementing something like this, so we can leave this as a theory at this point. As for this sort of tram thing that's moving back and forth across the flames, we could say that functionally it's giving the exhaust ports a moment to cool down so that they don't overheat, and its vertical motion could perhaps be explained with magnets, but there doesn't appear to be any sort of tether that would prevent it from being launched in the direction of the flames. And usually for something like this we would see some sort of gravity tether if we were to rely on gravity manipulation. These next spinning bladed cylinders have a bit less obvious usefulness, but I think their most likely application here is probably as flywheels. Basically, this is just a massive object spinning along a cylinder that effectively stores rotational energy. And so when the driving force that's turning the cylinder stops, the inertia of the flywheel results in it gradually releasing that rotational energy, which in effect keeps the axle spinning after the driver has stopped turning it. Very interestingly, this is effectively a mechanical analog to an electrical capacitor, which is probably a topic that deserves its own video. As we approach the end of this hydrogen processing facility, we pass through another damper, which appears to be adequately placed given the certainly higher pressure we're about to encounter. This staged combustion chamber, for lack of a better term, appears to be using the combustion products from these circular burners to heat up the air within the room and drive it out through a turbine, producing electricity. Now this is essentially a best guess given one of the two directions that the fan could be spinning in, and a potential alternative could be that the non-reactive combustion products could be used to pressurize the combustion reactants. But the cyclical nature of this process would only really make sense if this was used as part of a rocket engine or some sort of propulsive system instead. Thus, assuming this room is basically a large thermodynamic generator, the combustor firing sequence seems like it could perhaps be optimized by burning them in a reverse order than what we see in the game, where the combustor closest to the fan fires first, followed by the next farthest away, and then the furthest from the fan. Each combustor ring will produce a pressure wave away from the ring, which on one end will go straight to the turbine, and then the other will reflect off of the other end of the cylindrical room. The side with the deflecting wave will dissipate that energy into the air within the room, thus allowing less of it to be extracted. And so to optimize this burn sequence, you could start with the combustor furthest from the turbine, followed by shortly after the next closest combustor, and then finally the combustor immediately next to the turbine. You'd also want the timing to be a lot tighter on these, so that the pressure wave of each ring is amplified by the next one firing in sequence. Conceptually then, this would resemble a pulse detonation engine, which is a still rather experimental propulsion system, but is also similar to the operation of a pulse jet. a very simple propulsion system with no moving parts, which was also the first project that I uploaded to this YouTube channel. And with that, at the end of Chapter 8, there's a short cutscene that explains where things are going in the next chapter.
God, Isaac. Glad to see you've got all your parts.
You alright?
Yeah.
There are 4 steps.
No thanks to Twitchy here.
1, 2, 3, 4. Step 4. She'll be waiting.
Jesus, Strauss. You okay?
It's getting worse.
What is step 4? Who will be waiting?
F the screws. F the needle. She'll be waiting.
He's not gonna make it. We gotta keep moving.
There's an industrial transport upstairs. Runs on the same spoke as the commuter train. It should get us to government sector. One of us will have to deploy it from the gear house.
Staring. Asking.
Stay here and, try to get him on his feet.
F the needle. She'll be waiting.
Chapter 9 starts us off in the pressurization control tower, where immediately we encounter flaming elevators and gigantic storage tanks. Now, since we've just come from hydrogen processing into this sector, it seems reasonable to assume that the pressurization that's going on here is for fuel. We could then say it's likely that this is the pressurization control system responsible for delivering fuel to various locations throughout the station, or at least in the tower's vicinity. Now, we've already discussed that Titan Station is likely powered by some high-output nuclear reaction processes. Assuming that they are using fusion power, this fuel pressurization system would be responsible for delivering large amounts of hydrogen fuel to the reactors across the station. On that note, I would say that it's probably more likely that there are a large number of smaller fusion reactors rather than several large ones. But this assumption is based on modern implementations of nuclear fusion power generation, assuming that the fusion reactors themselves don't scale up too well. Additionally, assuming that fusion propulsion systems are also a thing at this point in time, the pressurization control system could be responsible for delivering hydrogen fuel to shipping ports in order to refill ships stocked with Titan Station. And finally, while we don't really see much evidence of this in-game, it could be possible that some of the hydrogen is being used for radiation shielding, which it is fairly effective at as long as you have a sufficient volume of the hydrogen. And so it's possible this might require an additional loop to maintain sufficient mass for radiation protection purposes. So, about those flaming elevators. The purpose of these machines is not immediately evident by inspection. There doesn't seem to be much of anything that's triggering the flame to occur, and also not really much reason why it would be moving upwards and downwards the way we see it. Regarding the basic operation of the machine, it seems like the fuel for the flame is pumped into the cylindrical scaffold from below. Upon being ignited, the force of the deflagration pushes the cylindrical ring upwards. Once the flame is extinguished, it gradually falls back down to the ground, and its fall is perhaps cushioned by some sort of magnetic system. As far as why it's doing this, that's a little harder to answer. The most likely thing I could think of was that this could essentially be a sort of relief valve for overpressured hydrogen tanks, in which, upon the system realizing that a tank is overpressurized, it will vent some hydrogen into this room and ignite it. This actually would work out fairly well since the combustion products of hydrogen and oxygen is water. So as long as this chemical reaction is maintained within the controlled space of the elevator, it could provide an alternative to venting the hydrogen out into space, ultimately wasting it. Instead, the mass of the hydrogen is preserved, albeit in the form of water mist, which the room does seem to have quite a bit of. Now, under normal conditions, you probably wouldn't want your hydrogen to constantly be venting into the relief valve, but we're certainly not operating under nominal conditions right now, and perhaps the system controlling the relief valves was stuck on. Now, there's one other potential application of this system here, though it's probably not as likely as the relief valve. When the space shuttle was about to launch, a few seconds before igniting the engines, a sort of chaff system was fired underneath the rocket to burn up any pockets of hydrogen that might have collected underneath the rocket. This would ensure that you don't get sudden bursts of flame in your highly controlled rocket exhaust area. Similar hardware is also used for the SLS launch pad. Now, in-game, we could maybe say it's possible this flame elevator is intended to perhaps burn off any pockets of hydrogen that have leaked out of the tanks into this room. Being lighter than the air, the hydrogen would float up to the top of the room, as long as gravity is active, where it would eventually diffuse over to the fire elevators. There's probably a lot more effective ways of actually burning off excess hydrogen, though, such as the vent valve that we just talked about. Nevertheless, this could perhaps be an auxiliary benefit of this system. Just when you thought we were past writing up safety violations for lack of railings over giant pits. I think I'll at least give them the benefit of the doubt here, though, just because these jutting additional platforms are about the same height as the railing, so perhaps we could assume that they've been stuck in the deployed position. Alright, well I won't take away any points for having a messy shelf, considering the situation that we find ourselves in here. It does seem rather strange that these shelves are built into the wall immediately in front of several junction boxes that presumably need to be accessed on a somewhat regular basis. And this isn't just a shelf that was placed here, this is actively built into this wall in front of these panels. These ones are numbered 4 and 3, and we can see 1 and 2 at the other end of this hallway. Best case scenario, these shelves are built over fully deprecated systems that no longer need to be accessed. And worst case scenario, they're built over actively utilized circuits, which having limited accessibility to could impede actually being able to cycle them in a timely manner. But just about anywhere in between these extremes is probably also not a great idea. The design of these support towers that carry the weight of the tram management system at the top seems like it could be optimized, though it's not actually terrible as it is. Now, one of the first things they teach you in engineering school is how to draw a free body diagram. This is essentially a graph of all the forces and their directions within a structure. Here, this one is actually pretty easy, and the tower is mostly composed of beams at right angles to each other. Now, even if you're not an engineer, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of a cantilever, even if you don't know the name. This is basically like trying to sit on the edge of a table. When you have a force that's applied at the end of a beam that's fixed at the other end, you create a moment, which is essentially a torque, about that fixed point. And depending on the material properties, the beam will then bend if enough force is applied. So to prevent the beam from bending, you can add supports, which will provide reactive forces that counter the applied force to the beam itself. And thus, in order to get a static structure, you want the sum of all forces to be equal to 0. Civil engineers live for this sort of thing, because when you're building a building, you generally don't want it to be moving when a force is applied. Now, if we take a look at a simplified 2D symmetric free body diagram of the support tower we see in the game, we can see that it is made up of a repeating pattern of beams with support struts connecting at the midpoint of these smaller beams in the middle. Now, the outermost beam from the wall is going to be doing most of the work as it holds up the weight that's being applied to the beam. The wall that the tower is attached to is also providing support at the fixed point at the end of the beam. Now, the next trick with this would be to move into mechanics of materials, which is what they teach you in the second semester at engineering school. We don't need to go into too much of that though, because basically all we're concerned about is whether or not this outer beam can support the full weight of the upper beam without being compressed more than the beam can handle. If that happens, this outer support strut could crumple and potentially lead to the whole tower failing. So we can reduce the compressive force on these beams by adding in these diagonal struts, which being diagonal will produce a limited reaction force, but will still be helpful at reducing the compressive force on the outermost beam. The result then is a reduced bending moment. Okay, we're about to head back to the game now, just stay with me. Because these diagonal support struts are connected at the middle of the beam, it's basically creating two cantilever systems here, where you have the beam bending off the wall and then to a greater extent off this medium point. So to avoid this double cantilever system, you could modify the structure such that the diagonal beams would connect to the beam at the furthest point from the wall, where the vertical strut is also attached. This way, all of your supporting forces are being applied at the same point on the beam, and you've also formed a triangular structure, which overall is a lot better at handling loads for a lot of the reasons I just discussed. So the whole point of this long-winded lecture on structural mechanics is that the tram support tower that we see in-game is not as poorly designed as it could have been. But if it were me, I would have made some modifications to the tower such that it has these triangular support struts. Now you have also come across a decision point. You can take the blue book and continue learning how to balance structures and master the materials that they are made of. Or you can take the other blue book and learn what happens when the sum of forces in a free body diagram is not equal to 0. Whatever you choose, choose wisely. One will lead to a career building weapons, and the other will lead to a career building targets. At around this point in the game, we're able to equip the vintage suit. The design of this suit is notably antiquated compared to the rest of the suits we see in the game, and even the materials it's made of seem to be perhaps cheaper in quality, such as the helmet being made apparently of some sort of forged or hammered metal. The vintage suit is also much bulkier than the other suits we get to use, and this difference is likely due to the suit being a pressurized suit rather than a mechanical counterpressure design. Now, to put this very briefly, you basically need to have something pressurizing the outside of your skin when you're in space. Otherwise, the skin will expand due to the internal pressure of your body. There's basically two ways to do this. You can either have pressurized air on the outside, which is effectively how your body acts on the surface of Earth, or you can use a mechanical counterpressure suit, which instead of using air pressure provides physical pressure, which is applied across the surface of the body using the fabric itself, effectively acting as a second skin. This is of course great for mobility, but it's also a lot more difficult to build and actually put on one of these suits. One big challenge to the design and operation of these suits is that there are a lot of difficult contours in parts of the human body that all need to be pressurized, and so getting the suit to fit around those contours can be difficult and also somewhat uncomfortable. So while mechanical counterpressure suits are functionally possible, pressurized spacesuits are overall easier to manufacture and put on in a reasonable amount of time. This isn't to say that mechanical counterpressure suits won't ever work, but for now, historical and modern spacesuits are using air pressurization instead of mechanical counterpressure. The point of all this is that the bulkiness of the vintage suit suggests that it is using an air pressure system rather than mechanical counterpressure like the other suits. This could suggest that the mechanical counterpressure system used in the newer suits is very new, and perhaps has only become generally available in the last several decades perhaps. Or alternatively, as suggested by the materials, the vintage suit is a cheaper option that can utilize the more tried and true method of air pressurization systems. One of the hallways we go through takes us over a steam distribution system that allows the steam to vent into the corridor. Now, the potential health hazards of this are lessened if we go off of our previous conclusion that the large pressurization room is for the combustion of hydrogen and oxygen into water vapor. However, by allowing the steam to flow into this corridor, it's going to increase the humidity pretty significantly. And if there's sufficient temperature differences between the steam and the walls and mechanisms mounted to them, then you're going to get condensation, which could eventually lead to rust, depending on the materials. Especially in this panel directly above the steam vent, you're going to get a much higher humidity and thus condensation. And if there are any moving parts in these mechanisms, they're going to be more likely to become immobilized due to rust. Or in other words, here you might end up having some steam jams.
Shut up! Just shut up!
At the top of this pressurization control tower, we find the tram car that connects to the rest of the Titan Station tram system. The tram railing system is supported by a fixed structure from which it hangs. The tram can then slide along this structure as it moves into place to connect with the rest of the tram system. Curiously though, there does not appear to be any mechanism by which the tram can be moved across this auxiliary track. There is a rotational shaft that connects to the structure, which we need to repair to get the tram moving, but there does not appear to be any obvious mechanism by which the rotational motion of this shaft is converted into linear motion of the tram. Instead, the shaft appears to be rotating about an I-beam, and the tram just moves towards us on its own.
Alright, I release the transport. Meet me at the landing.
We'll be right there. Strauss, come on. Come on.
Also, as part of this drive shaft, we can see what appears to be a universal joint. These are intended to allow two different shafts at different angles to connect to one another and transmit rotational motion across a bend. A pair of them can often be seen in vehicle drive shafts, where you need to align two different shafts that aren't necessarily lined up directly with each other. Now, there are two of these universal joints within this shaft, but the shaft itself appears to be supported by a form of bearing in this wall, which is partly hollow, perhaps to allow airflow through. This then would at least imply that this shaft is not capable of being bent. And so the pair of universal joints isn't really going to accomplish anything here, since the driven end of the shaft is always going to be aligned with the driving end.
Oh my god. It can't be. That's the Ishimura.
Yeah. Used to be the pride of the CEC. It's a sad story, actually. I heard everybody on board died. Some sort of terrorist attack.
What? Terrorist attack? What happened aboard that ship was no terrorist attack.
What do you mean?
That's where all this started, Ellie. Everything that's happening here happened on that ship. I saw it. I was on board when it happened.
What's happening?
I don't know. Something must be blocking the track.
Stay here. I'll take a look.
Ellie, there's a giant tentacle blocking the transport door. It's wrapped around a big tank.
A big tank? Nitrogen trichloride. Those explode if they overheat.
Perfect.
Now, once again, I'm probably not enough of a chemist to speak with great authority on this matter, but with a little research, I was able to find that nitrogen trichloride is in fact explosive. A fact first discovered by Pierre-Louis Dulong in the early 1800s, who lost 3 fingers and an eye while discovering the substance. Not wanting anyone else to be hurt, he kept his discovery a secret, and so Sir Humphrey Davy also discovered this compound and also injured his eye in an explosion. This prompted him to hire Michael Faraday as an assistant, and both of them were then injured in another explosion. Nowadays, nitrogen trichloride can be found in swimming pools, where it is partly responsible for the chlorine smell that I'm sure you would recognize, and forms in small quantities from reactions to urine in the water. As far as why there are such large quantities of it here, I would imagine that they are probably primarily intended for mining applications, more so than for fuel purposes, since the volatility of the chemical would make it more difficult to safely store and process whenever it's not inside of an engine, as we see in this sequence.
That worked. We're moving again. We'll wait for you up ahead.
All right, I see you. I'll meet you there.
And with that, we have effectively completed Chapter 9. I'll let these next few cutscenes play out to give us an idea of where we're going next in Chapter 10.
Okay, Ellie, get ready. One more.
What? Are you crazy? That one in the middle. If you set that off, it will incinerate everything in here.
Yes, it will. Tell Strauss to hold on. Here we go. Faster, Ellie! Faster!
I can't make it go any faster!
Come on!
In another situation, I might admire your persistence, Mr. Clark. But this is bigger than you and bigger than the lives of everyone on this station.
Sir, final preparations for attack are wrapping up.
Looks like it is here. At this point, it's all just dead weight.
Isaac, what did he mean? What did he mean when he said dead weight?
He's using the solar beam. We gotta stop the transport now!
Oh, shit. He's cut the station in half. There's no track to get across on.
Back us up. Back us up to the station.
What? Why?
Just do it, Ellie. Hurry. The Ishimura. If the gravity tethers are still functional, I can...
You can snag Govsec and drag it back? Isaac, this is ridiculous.
If I can line the tracks up just for a few seconds, you should be able to get the transport across. Stay ready. And take care of Strauss.
Isaac, no. This is a really bad idea.
I'll stick around. I'm full of bad ideas.
Now, since the majority of this chapter takes place on board the Ishimura, I'll just focus on things that have changed since the previous game. And if you're interested in a more in-depth review of the Ishimura, consider checking out my review of Dead Space 2023.
Ellie, I'm in. There should still be a computer in the flight lounge. I can check the ship's status from there.
Are you okay? You sound a little nervous.
Last time I was here, things didn't go so well. Look, I'll contact you soon.
It appears that the majority of the Ishimura has remained intact after the events of the previous game, and at least since it's arrived at Titan Station, an extensive cleanup operation has been in effect. And whether it's intentional or not, the amount of red tape on the walls here is rather ironic. Now, I won't go into too much detail about it here, but there's actually quite a lot of science behind the operation of toilets in space, and if you really want to learn about that, you can look it up for yourself.
Gravity and life support on reserve power. Primary systems offline. Main centrifuge offline for repairs.
Damn it. That's what I thought.
What?
The gravity centrifuge is under repair. I'm gonna have to go down to engineering. This should be interesting.
Now, this is one difference between the original Dead Space and the 2023 remake, was that the centrifuge was in the original game used to actually generate the gravity tethers, versus in the remake it's used to stabilize the ship while the gravity tethers are operational. Barring knowledge of the unified field theory, it's hard to say if the original is more or less realistic than the revised version, but even without knowing the physics of the gravity tethers, we can still say that the operation of the centrifuge does make sense in the remake. According to its interface, the elevator has a max load of 2,500 kilograms. This is pretty substantial, but understandable for a mining vessel, but what is less understandable is the last service date that is listed at the bottom of the screen. The year number, 42, is 4 years prior to the launch of the Ishimura and 1 year before construction was even started. Not to mention that if the elevator actually hadn't been serviced since this date, it would have been 70 years since somebody checked on it. so hopefully this is just a case of developer oversight, since even with the ridiculously lax safety culture in Dead Space, I would still be quite surprised if it was actually 70 years between elevator servicings. As was implied by the operation of the tram in the first game, this tram system graphic implies that there is in fact a single line that connects all points on the ship. However, the graphic illustrates the tram system as a loop rather than a straight line. This is probably just a simplified graphic though, and so it's probably primarily just intended for informational purposes. Now within the gravity centrifuge room, we do see that there is in fact a walkway to the service area from the hallway access point. This is in contrast to what I said in my previous review, as many people pointed out that there was a growth that had destroyed the walkway rather than it being absent completely. In this game, we can see that it has been repaired since then. While this centrifuge repair is an implementation of a classic style of video game puzzles, the way the cable harnessing is routed is a little bit curious from an engineering perspective. The repaired cable does form 1.5 complete loops around the cylinder, which could perhaps imply that there is some electromagnetic application of this cable routing system. If you apply enough current to this cable, it would produce an electromagnetic field centered along the cylinder center line, which could in some way be helpful with the graviton emission part of the centrifuge operation. I have a feeling though that if you really needed an intense magnetic field for the operation of this machine, there's probably better ways of integrating a coil into the system. Additionally, when repairing the circuit, the connecting pieces just slide into place. Now I suppose there could perhaps be a strictly coplanar connection system that is used to connect each cable segment, but compared with most modern cable connection systems, this seems unlikely.
Ellie, I've got the centrifuge online. I'm heading back towards the tram station.
Okay, I've almost got us disconnected from the mag rail. Keep me posted. How's it going at your end? And please tell me this plan is going to work.
I'm almost there. I'm headed to the bridge now to activate the gravity tethers.
Well, good. They're swarming in through a hole in the medical deck. At least you won't have to go through there.
Unexpected obstruction ahead. Shutting down. Welcome to the medical deck.
Crap.
After an unexpected and comedic detour to the medical deck, we can see that a large number of black lights have still been set up to help with decontamination. There are several signs warning of etiological agents, which is apparently a term in medicine and philosophy referring to discovering the cause of something, in this case a disease. These signs could suggest then that during the Ishimura recovery process, the medical deck was kept as is without as significant cleanup procedures in an attempt to ascertain what exactly caused this whole incident. Once we arrive at the bridge of the Ishimura, we can see that the remaining core of Titan is now swaying in space, now only partially suspended by connecting struts to the rest of the station. Now, it perhaps could be possible that the Ishimura is the thing that's swaying, but if we look out one of the side windows, we can still see the rest of Titan Station, and it's not moving. It seems unlikely that the solar beam that cut the tram line in half would have imparted enough force to cause the remaining core to sway so significantly. And so it's probably more likely that it is the Ishimura that's swaying, and the stationary station in the background is just an oversight. As I mentioned, since I've already reviewed the Ishimura in great detail in my previous video, I'm just going to keep this chapter short, and I'll play the next couple cutscenes just to give us an idea of where we're going next in the story.
Gravity tethers engaged.
You did it! Now get back here, the tracks are moving!
No, just go! I'll use one of the escape pods to meet you there. Now go!
You idiot! Gravity tethers would tear the whole moon apart!
Time to go.
Ejection sequence initiated. Launch in 3, 2, 1. Launch.
We start off Chapter 11 after the Ishimura escape pod has crashed into a hangar bay on the Titan core. This hangar apparently serves as a loading bay for CEC mining operations on the remainder of the moon. Similar to what we saw in the hangar bay of the Ishimura, this loading deck makes use of a force field to keep the air inside the hangar and the vacuum of space outside. Now, somebody pointed out on my previous Dead Space review was that there is actually some technological basis for this in the form of plasma windows, which is basically what it sounds like, being a planar plasma sheath. While this technology is functional on small scales, it hasn't really progressed beyond that in the 30 years or so since it was invented. And so perhaps the expanded model of physics that exists in the Dead Space universe could be responsible for bringing about the implementation that we see in the game. The mineshaft access ramp appears to have been constructed such that there could be an easy way to wheel up carts of ore from the interior of the mine, as well as perhaps to drive vehicles down into the lower levels, and possibly also since the mine access level wasn't low enough to justify an elevator. Now this is all well and good, but I would probably suggest that there could be railings added such that when you're lugging around heavy mining gear, you're less likely to slip and fall and roll down the ramp. Although it's possible that's what these yellow bars are for on the ground and the railings are just not deployed at the moment. The fan in the ceiling of this ready room appears to be spinning backwards based on the design of the individual fan blades. It appears that these fan blades are constructed with an airfoil cross-section, which is the shape that's used in aircraft wings and is used to generate lift based on the differences in flow speeds between the top and bottom surfaces. Anytime you have an airfoil, you want the thicker edge to be the one that's facing into the flow, known as the leading edge, since that's the whole reason the airfoil is designed the way it is. The blades of this fan appear to be rotating in such a way that the thinner end of the airfoil, what is typically the trailing edge, is rotating into the airstream, which would not produce the benefits afforded by using an airfoil as a cross-section. Along some of the hallways of the collapsed mine shafts, we can see that there are two pipelines that route along the corridors. The yellow one is labeled as hot metal, and the red one is labeled as no step, which is probably a good label to have regardless of its contents. Now, given our position inside the deep, cold mines of Titan, my best guess would be that these are either for an air heating and circulation system, or fluid connection lines for a heat exchanger of some kind. If this was also used for air filtration systems, then you could get a double benefit out of this routing. But at the same time, it might also be beneficial to add diffusers to these pipes such that the warm air could be exhausted into the tunnels that they're running through. Although this point is really dependent on the layout of the tunnels and the capabilities of the air heating system that is being used here. Also at various points throughout the mineshaft, we can see these metal mesh nets that are laid over the walls and ceiling of the tunnel, presumably to capture small rocks that would otherwise fall into the walkway. Now, while I don't know if this is a common practice in actual mine operations on Earth, it seems like it would be most useful when mining through rock that has a tendency to break apart into smaller rocks more so than crumble into dust. Whether or not that applies to Titan is pretty far into planetary science and possibly beyond the available data we have today. Inside the first large mine that we enter, we can see a number of pump jacks out in the distance over a bottomless pit. The most likely explanation for this is that these are being used to mine for any residual water that might be left on the remainder of Titan's core. As previously mentioned, given Titan's strategic location in the outer solar system, water is probably one of the more valuable resources that could be mined from it. And indeed, we can see that there's apparently quite a lot of condensation in this room, so perhaps we could infer from this that Titan has only been mined down to the lower level of what used to be its subsurface ocean. Or perhaps that the subsurface ocean floor is now close to the surface of Titan, and as such some residual water could be left inside what's left of the moon. It is rather curious that these pump jacks are located out over a bottomless pit without any obvious way of actually accessing them for maintenance, and it also doesn't look like there's any obvious way the water is being pumped away from the pump jack. It's very nice to see that there are some large heaters within this mineshaft. Now, while Titan's core is not as active as that of Earth, it does still receive some tidal heating from gravitational effects of Saturn. Even so, though, the interior of Titan would be at a much colder temperature than the interior of Earth, since there would be little or no geothermal heating going on, and so you would definitely need some additional heat sources in order for people to actually be working down there. On one of the support struts on the base level of the mine, we can see a very egregious high voltage cable that has almost no protection whatsoever from the walkable surface around it. Granted, it does have a large sign on it to warn people that yes, this is high voltage, as you can tell from the sparks and smoke coming out of the cables, but it's also located right next to an uneven surface, so if somebody were to lose their balance next to this thing and reach out and grab it to stabilize themselves, they could easily end up in a much more stable situation than they intended. Also throughout this room, there are a lot of ladders that don't really seem to lead anywhere, some of which don't really have any sort of fall arrestor system, but that's kind of expected at this point. I suppose if a microgravity environment was artificially induced in this room, these ladders could perhaps be good jumping off and latching onto points when you're flying around the room in zero gravity, but in the presence of gravity, they seem to be more useless than helpful. Or perhaps even hazardous, as somebody could try to jump off one of these thinking that they could survive the fall.
Attention shift workers. Be mindful of the nearest survival chamber. These are your only hope of survival should a cave-in occur.
Wow, that sounds really important. Are there any signs pointing to a survival chamber that I could reference, perhaps? No? Anyone? If you watch this next sequence closely, you can see that the tentacle pulls Isaac out into space without actually breaking any sort of barrier between the vacuum and the tunnel that we were in previously. Although this is probably just a development oversight, as you're not going to notice it in this quick cutscene unless you were doing something crazy like looking through every frame of a video game to see if things are realistic or not. Maybe in that case. This large superstructure we encounter in space appears to be a docking port for some of their ships to access the mining facility on Titan. The jet bridge-like extended airlock that we see in the center is presumably to allow crew access between the mining operation and the ship, and the hexagonal trusses are likely for the ship to latch onto to complete its docking maneuver. Seeing as how this docking system is a lot more intricate than the plasma window cargo bay that we saw at the beginning of this chapter, it's possible that this was an earlier installation to work with simpler airlock-based ships before the open-air landing pad was constructed and operational. Also in this vicinity, we can see several mining laser modules that are actuated by small robotic arms attached to the truss structure. The beams on these laser modules are also pretty visible here, but we could say this is probably just due to the high concentration of dust in the vicinity. If these are lasers intended for mining operations, which is a pretty reasonable assumption, I'd say, it could perhaps be the case that this truss structure was brought into the Titan core to start with, and then these lasers were used to carve out a space in front of it to allow ships to dock with the truss structure. This would produce a sort of natural shielding around the resulting hangar, so to speak, that could protect the ship from orbital debris. The plan here might have also been to eventually install one of the plasma windows we saw earlier, but perhaps they just never got around to it for this one, or there was a change of plans on the mining operation. The inclusion of the deployable thruster pods that we saw earlier in the game could perhaps be for either helping adjust a ship with docking in case its primary thrusters were offline or failing, or perhaps for manually realigning the lasers as we do in-game. However, it's important to keep in mind though that these are solid rocket motors, and as we discussed, they're a lot more difficult to control than a liquid rocket engine, which would probably be better suited for these applications. With a final and breathless gaze through weary and yet uninitiated eyes back toward the desiccated metropolis, the deathly stars blossom and fizzle all across the nebular and gargantuan husk, destined like all things to return to the dust in which it coated itself over the decades of ceaseless and soulless toil and the twin names of progress and survival.
Ellie, I'm back inside. Where are you? Where's Strauss?
I'm safe for now, but he's lost it. I think he's coming for you. I found something you're going to want to see. Here's my location. Oh, hurry and get here. I'm not in any shape to be fighting.
I'll get there as soon as I can. Stay safe.
In the center of the next large room we come across, a cargo loading crane can be seen prominently hanging from the ceiling, suspended over what appears to be a designated cargo loading zone. As this crane doesn't seem to have much in the way of claws, we can assume that these are electromagnetic grabbers, and presumably it's intended to lift a cargo container of some kind, rather than individual chunks of ore. Judging by the height of the crane gripper, though, there doesn't seem to be much space for the crane to unload anywhere than this designated zone that we see in the lower walkway. So we can then assume that this crane is used to grab things from the pit below us and then bring them up to this loading platform. Also, the dual fans on the crane gripper itself suggest that the electromagnetic it uses to grab cargo containers is powered with onboard systems rather than receiving power from somewhere else. On the one hand, this increases the mass that the crane system will have to lift with it every time the arm goes up and down, but at the same time it reduces the likelihood of a power failure resulting in dropping of cargo. So it's probably a trade-off between performance and reliability. Despite yet another set of exposed high-voltage cables, it's at least nice to see that they still have these large heaters placed throughout the mine, since they're probably going to get more important the deeper you get into the core. I'll also say that compared to a lot of the accommodations we saw in the Ishimura, these break rooms in the mine seem pretty well outfitted, at least as far as space accommodations go. That is, of course, assuming that these aren't permanent quarters for workers in the mines, which, now that I think about it, probably also seems fairly likely. I'm not entirely sure what's happening with this fire here. I suppose if there's anything flammable running through these pipes, perhaps that could be providing fuel to the fire, or perhaps some coating over these structural components was more flammable than they intended, although apparently somebody did sign off on this thing not being flammable. But in any case, at least it's probably pretty warm. Now this sequence here highlights a potential flaw in the design of these folding helmets, and that if they are impacted in the right way, they will just simply retract on their own, which could be a problem if you were working in an environment where you could reasonably expect something to impact your helmet. I also kind of always thought this scene escalated rather quickly, but to be fair, it is a life and death situation for Isaac, and he's got quite a lot of other things going on with his head right now. While being careful not to fall into another pit, we come across the exploration mine elevator that will take us back up to the main mine access point. I'll give the developers a point here, as this is a Class D elevator compared to the Class C ones that we've been using throughout the game, with a cargo capacity of approximately 10 times that of Class C. But I'll immediately take away that point, as they also say that this elevator was last serviced in 2767, which is 256 years after this game takes place. The elevator also doesn't have anything to prevent you from getting an arm or a tool pinched between the elevator and the stationary structure outside of it, or to prevent you from falling out the walkways while the elevator is in motion. And aside from some trusses that could perhaps be climbed, there doesn't really seem to be any sort of emergency exit from this elevator, but I feel like at this point that's maybe expecting too much. And finally, to conclude Chapter 11, it's at this point we finally get to access the advanced suit. Recalling what we talked about with the vintage suit, this one definitely utilizes a mechanical counterpressure design, with minimal armor to allow for maximum mobility. And perhaps aside from the mechanically assisted process of equipping the suit, the advanced suit reflects a high degree of optimization in spacesuit design. One curious point is that the helmet faceplate deployment mechanism on the chest plate is rather oversized compared to some of the other suits, but this could perhaps help with balancing the weight of the helmet between the user's front and back. That, combined with the lower weight of the suit overall, could perhaps help Isaac's posture when just walking around normally. Chapter 12 takes place in the exploration mine, which based on the name is presumably used for exploratory drilling to search for additional raw materials inside the remaining core of Titan. This is also a pretty quick chapter as well, since it basically just serves as a transition between chapters 11 and 13. Immediately upon entering the exploration mine, we can look up and see that there are a number of pipes that are behaving somewhat strangely. There's quite a lot of condensation dripping down from the ceiling, and at least some of this appears to be originating from the pipes. This would suggest that the pipes would be at a lower temperature than the surrounding room, resulting in water condensing out of the air onto the colder pipe. Additionally, though, on one of these set of pipes, we can see that there is also what appears to be steam or some sort of gas emanating from them. With this substance being in a gaseous form, that means that it must be at a higher temperature than its liquid state. There's also an occasional jet of steam that is emitted from this pipe corner in a manner that suggests that it is pressurized, which would correspond to a higher temperature. So from what we can observe, there appear to be some conditions that suggest that the contents of the pipes are liquids, and others that suggest that it must be gaseous. Now there are basically two different explanations I can think of for this, both of which involve two-phase flow. And we're already getting pretty far into psychrometrics and fluid states, so we're just going to keep this qualitative at this point. One option could be that this is a cryogenic fluid flowing through these pipes, but due to the temperature in the room, it is boiling off into a gas that is escaping through this leak in the pipe. Due to this elbow, the cryogenic liquid that remains at the lower half of the pipe could be leaking out in droplets through these pipe joints. This would mean that there is not actually any cryogenic fluid flowing through these pipes, and rather that it's just stagnant in the lower section. Now the other possible explanation I thought of was pretty similar, in that this could be a hot liquid flowing through these pipes that is near its boiling point, and would again be boiling into a gaseous state and also dripping through the pipe joints, but keeping a liquid at near boiling temperatures over an extended length of pipe that is in a cold environment is going to be very difficult without sufficient insulation or active heating of the pipe. And while given this environment, a high temperature liquid might make more sense than a cryogenic one, there are still applications where you might want something like liquid nitrogen, such as for a very high efficiency heat exchanger or for fracking purposes. And so I would tend to lean more towards that this is a cryogenic pipe than a high temperature one. Now I am making a mental note here to not go into this much detail over every pipe in every game that I review in the future, but this one kind of stood out to me, and it was rather curious of how this was actually supposed to happen. The massive excavator machine we use here resembles a continuous mining machine, along with some additional components that are reminiscent of a longwall mining operation. In a continuous miner, the front cylinder is used to scrape away the walls in front of the machine, and the excavated material is conveyed to the rear of the machine. This type of machine is also used in room and pillar mining operations, which you may be familiar with if you played Minecraft for long enough. Now, most of the mining equipment I found when researching this topic utilize only a single cylindrical cutting head, That is, with the exception of the Sandvik MF420, which technically is a boring miner, but also utilizes twin cylindrical cutting heads. In addition to a rather memeable name, is also the largest of these mining machines that are currently in production and operation today. The in-game mining machine also has what appear to be two long-wall shearers on either side of it. These operate by shearing away layers of a wall, along which the shearer moves horizontally perpendicular to the axis of rotation.
Well, this drill's a stroke of good luck finally. Why don't you get up to the cab to try to get it started? I'll look for the other power cell.
Alright. Let's see what I can do from up here.
Now, given how far we are in the future, it is a little curious that this excavator is not remotely operated or fully autonomous, considering how complex its operations must be and the potential benefits in efficiency that could perhaps be gained from an advanced automation system. However, we could perhaps say that this ties back into the need for a large amount of jobs that need to be provided for the overpopulated settlements on which these machines might be deployed. Well, I guess the advanced suit isn't so lightweight after all, if Isaac still isn't able to jump over a gap that's only a couple feet wide. Now, one other minor point to be made here is that the gravity that we're experiencing here is not characteristic of what one would experience on Titan, since the moon is much lower mass than Earth and the gravity is accordingly much less. Of course, we are operating in a future in which artificial gravity is a thing, so this isn't necessarily a deal breaker. It's just that in this location, there's no obvious source from which the artificial gravity is being generated. Fortunately, I can't say this much from personal experience, but this next sequence seems like a very realistic situation an engineer might find themselves in.
It doesn't recognize the new junction.
I think I've got it from up here.
Or maybe just rewired from down here.
What? I didn't hear you.
Nothing. Nothing.
I did it! I got it started. There, there's a lift on the other side. I'll turn around, you can get on.
Once the excavator does start moving, it's primarily driving through existing tunnels and not boring through additional rock. This goes a long way to explaining how it's able to move so quickly, as if it were actually drilling through solid rock at this point, this would be a pretty impressive speed, all things considered. And with that, we have effectively reached the end of the curiously short Chapter 12. As I mentioned, this chapter is mostly just a transition between 11 and 13, so I'll play the actual transition cutscene next.
Whoa. Whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa! Stop, stop!
Looks like we reached the foundation pylons of the government sector.
So how do we get in there?
Straight ahead. We do have a giant drill.
You know I'm right on top of this thing, right?
Ellie! 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 Ellie!
Well, we can compare bruises later. But at least we made it, right? And this is most definitely government sector. And I'm guessing that marker of yours is behind that huge door over there.
Well, we better move fast. Those things are gonna find a way up the hole we drilled. There's gotta be an elevator or something connecting these floors. I'm gonna try to make my way to you.
Alright, I'll meet you halfway.
As we begin Chapter 13 in the government sector of Titan Station, there's an immediate aesthetic shift to a much cleaner design style used here. This difference suggests that more funding has been put into developing more effective space technologies for use in this location to ensure high reliability of operations. The smoother design might also improve human factors considerations, since the environment is much less harsh than we saw on most of the rest of Titan Station. Although the overall bland white design style does get a bit old after a while, speaking from personal experience. It's also interesting to note that shortly after leaving the atrium we start this level in, we reach a docking bay that is overlooking the side of the Titan core that is facing Saturn, which is the opposite side of the remaining chunk to the one that Titan Station is located on, meaning that the mines that we used to get here traverse most of the remainder of the core, or at least across this one direction. We can also see above the gunship docking port that there is a timetable that appears very similar to the ones that we saw for the tram system. We can infer from this that Titan Station also uses shuttlecraft for transportation across the entirety of the sprawl. Whether or not this is more effective or faster than a tram system would probably depend on the implementation of the tram system itself, more so than the shuttlecraft. Flying across large distances of the station could be more direct, and we also see that the docking and undocking procedures can be done fairly quickly. So for urgent transportation of personnel, where time is of the essence, a shuttle transportation system would make a lot of sense. Although operating costs are likely going to be much higher than that for a tram system, so for general use in everyday operations, a tram would probably make more sense. Based on the presence of this reception desk, we can assume that this atrium is a controlled entry point to this portion of the government sector. It's a little hard to tell because the wall across from the reception desk has been completely destroyed by a mining excavator run amok, but based on some of the signage we can see throughout this area, we can assume that this is the portion of the government sector that is dedicated to laboratory research. Now, based on the orientation of this room compared to the view we have of Saturn and the planet-facing side of the Titan chunk, we can say that the entrance to this part of the government sector is probably not the one that's closest to the rest of Titan Station, since we did go through a pretty extensive mine shaft to get here, and we are still facing away from the rest of the station. This would suggest then that the government sector is comprised of other locations that are perhaps used for other administrative tasks, in addition to this research sector. Past reception, there is a central security sector that must be traversed in order to continue into the labs. Though the text is still pretty blurry due to the low-resolution textures, the procedures seem pretty reminiscent of modern-day TSA screening activities, which in itself makes a lot of sense. However, there are also a number of security cameras visible here that have a rather outdated design, especially for the 26th century. It could be possible, though, that these designs were chosen for the express purpose of these cameras being conspicuous, so that people always know that they're being watched in these areas. Inside a room overlooking central security, there is probably one of the most egregious oversights in engineering that I have seen in this entire game. By simply removing this one panel that is marked as a Kinesis-enabled device, and disconnecting this power cell, the entirety of central security shuts down and the bulkhead doors fail open. Now normally this last point would make a lot of sense for space applications, but considering this is a highly secure facility, this is definitely a problem. There's apparently also no backup system in place, so that if this power cell was removed, something else could kick on and prevent the whole thing from failing.
You compromised the compound, you idiot! If any of them reach the marker, fall back! Fall back to the marker chamber! We have to seal it off! And so, despite this facility looking much cleaner than the rest of Titan Station, it seems that they're still grinding down corners to the greatest extent possible in their engineering practices. On this familiar-looking hologram projector, there is an uncommon indication of the actual voltage being used by the machine. This high voltage suggests that this hologram projector could use some sort of plasma technology, and so the high voltage isn't entirely out of place here. What is out of place is another of these high voltage lines that is located immediately behind a bench in a waiting room. Now this could be fine if there was at least some sort of panel over it, but the panel over these cables doesn't actually completely prevent contact with them. So no leaning back on this electric bench when you're waiting for check-in, otherwise it could turn into an electric chair instead.
Kenner Phelps, research log 43509. I can't stop thinking about the formulas from patient 4's last session. They're so clearly ordered they keep playing back in my mind. The final configuration seems within reach. I can almost solve it myself. It's funny. I was telling Travis the other day that it's almost like it wants us to succeed. I've never seen anything like it. Once we finally solve this heuristic stabilization problem, we should be able to start growing the layers of the marker from the mineral baths.
At around this point, we come across EarthGov's attempts at recreating markers, based on the codes that past markers had imprinted upon their messengers. Brushing aside for a moment the horrific implications of this revelation, we can see that the markers are being grown out of mineral baths onto a marker-shaped support lattice. Now, crystal growth is a pretty advanced topic in material science, but at a basic level essentially revolves around particles within a solution arranging themselves into a lower energy thermodynamic state. The formation of ice is a fairly common example of this, but this process also occurs in the formation of other substances such as steel. In the case of the marker, it appears that what's happening here is some sort of chemical composition is being created based on the marker codes that under the right conditions eventually results in nucleation and crystal growth of the marker mineral structure. Now it's interesting to note that crystal formation on Earth is actually a lot more difficult than what can be accomplished in microgravity. since in the reduced gravitational environment, crystals are able to grow more uniformly and with higher purity. This has very promising implications for pharmaceutical development, since the microgravity environment of space allows proteins to be grown more accurately. This basically means that pharmaceutical experiments can be conducted on a high-fidelity target protein that is affected by the disease that they're trying to cure. The microgravity environment can also be helpful for crystalline growth of certain pharmaceuticals themselves. Aside from medical applications, crystallization experiments in space have also focused on the formation of concrete, which could potentially be highly impactful for construction of future settlements on other planets, which I have to admit does actually make civil engineering sound pretty cool for once. So overall, getting back to the game, the takeaway from this is that the marker growth could probably be accelerated by doing so in a microgravity environment as opposed to the artificial gravity that's being used here. Also within this laboratory section, we can see a number of plant growth chambers that appear to be testing the growth conditions of plants under various different conditions. The plants in chambers labeled with NO2 are presumably being grown in an Earth-like atmosphere, since nitrogen and oxygen are the two primary constituents of the air we breathe on Earth. Some of the other chambers, though, are listed with an XE symbol, which normally I would interpret as indicating xenon, a noble gas that does occur in some small concentrations within Earth's atmosphere. But perhaps a more likely implication of this symbol is that it is referring to the inclusion of xenobiological material within the plant growth chamber. Or in other words, the plants are being exposed to either a piece of the marker or one of the marker's creations. One of these chambers only has a single indicator for xenobiological material and not for nitrox, which could perhaps be in reference to the marker's ability to reanimate dead cells.
The dampening system built into the shielding around the marker testbed should be blocking the signal entirely, but I swear the dementia signal is still getting through. Not a single thing registers on any sensor outside the shield walls. Put the same sensor inside with the marker and it goes off the charts. So we either miss something entirely or I don't know what. If we have... Oh man, please heaven help us.
There's another chamber that has a radioactivity symbol on it, and apparently the plants inside have grown more greatly than the others. This could perhaps be a reference to gamma gardens, which were a thing in post-World War II research on peaceful applications of remaining nuclear materials. The idea was basically just to irradiate plants for a certain amount of time and see what happens. And as might be expected, exposure to high amounts of radiation would inevitably kill some plants, but some other plants developed useful mutations that were then cultivated. So I suppose if you really wanted to, you could say that this is basically the plant version of X-Men. A very minor note here, but I believe this is the first time I've seen the word analyzation instead of analysis. Maybe do a double take, but apparently this is an actual word, just a rare one. Inside the marker reconstruction room, there is a diagram that appears to show several different chemicals used in the construction of the marker. I don't think I'm enough of a chemist to recognize these shapes without additional information, but if anyone watching can make more sense out of this, I would appreciate if you could leave a comment explaining what's happening here. One additional note on this topic is that based on this document that I found on the wiki and haven't been able to place since then, mentions the chemical bismuth zirconate titanate, which as far as I can tell appears to be a form of ceramic that has ferroelectric properties and is often used in capacitors for energy storage. This is likely in reference to the marker's ability to emit seemingly limitless electromagnetic energy. As for the reconstruction room itself, it appears that this room is intended for some sort of surface treatment of the partially grown markers. Judging by the potency of these lasers, this is perhaps some sort of heat treatment. Regardless of this room's function though, the floor plan is terribly designed, with small laboratories along the corners that don't have any way of accessing them other than running through this room in which high-power lasers can be operating. At the very least, there should be an emergency stop for the system if somebody were to be trapped in one of these rooms, so you don't have to worry about outrunning the laser armatures. This is also a point in the game where I feel like it would make sense for Isaac to just crawl underneath these lasers, since we've already seen that he's more than capable of crawling through maintenance ducts in a bulky spacesuit. This upper walkway has a gap in the wall to access the maintenance facility on the top of the marker laser system. While this maintenance path was being deployed, I was thinking I've probably been going too harsh on the whole railings thing, and probably could just look past this one. Except this one actually does have railings on it, so somebody was thinking ahead here.
Kenner Phelps, research log 43546. Success. The marker layer held up. It is a fully expressed physical representation of the heuristic algorithms from patient 4, with no breakdowns. The construction schedule begins in earnest tomorrow. Celebration is tonight. I hope I don't black out in the middle of the party. I'm anxious, for some reason.
Now, as I'm not a computer scientist, I could be slightly off on this next point, but as far as I can tell, a heuristic algorithm is essentially a way of saying that the algorithm is a method of approximating an optimal solution with basically a shortcut. With this interpretation, then, we can say that the marker code is acting as a best guess approximation for recreating the original black marker, since construction of one of these original markers would not be possible with existing technology, as we'll come to find out at some point in the future.
Tanner Phelps, research log 43549. I blacked out early last night and woke up this morning staring at a tiny, fully formed version of the marker in one of the crystal layer printing baths. I had entered the entire heuristic sequencing algorithm. I can still hear it in my mind, like a song now. I know the dementia suppressors are working, but this is something entirely different.
Just before accessing the main project chamber, we enter a sort of liminal space that illustrates just how big this project actually was. The resources, time, manpower, and energy that would be required to construct a facility of this scale, and in deep space no less, all paint a convicting picture of EarthGov, who must have known the full implications of this project before starting it if they were willing to commit this heavily to it. And so this scene is perhaps one of the best examples that human life is considered expendable in the Dead Space universe if it means the survival of humanity.
Oh my god. I built that. What? What are they doing?
They're all coming to the marker. Convergence is at hand.
I didn't feel trouble from the start, but they told me you were necessary. That your mind was the purest. I spent years sifting through your demented brain. This is not the way it was supposed to happen.
Well, how was it supposed to happen,
We
Timon?
had it under control. Clark, this is not our fault. We were so close to understanding it. Just hold those bodies you let in here. It's triggering a convergence event. But we never expected this many bodies.
What the hell's it doing?
What it was made to do. Isaac, you have to make us whole.
And finally, as we're about to conclude Chapter 13, I would probably recommend skipping this next sequence if you have any sort of eye appointment coming up in the near future. So if you just want to skip to Chapter 14, you can go to the timestamp on screen now. The Noonlight Diagnostics machine resembles an MRI and is used to activate the part of the brain that is susceptible to the marker's signals. It does this by inserting a sample of xenobiological material into the user's brain. This region is the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is responsible for visual perception, among other things. And in order to go deeper into this, we would have to get into some pretty advanced neuroscience, and so at this point I think I'll leave this discussion for another review. Regarding the Noonlight machine itself, though, we can see that the machine itself is wired pretty haphazardly, suggesting that this is either a late addition to this project or that it has been overclocked in some manner. Either option would serve to increase the apprehension I would have to actually use this thing.
Step 1. Crawl inside. Step 2. The screws go tight. All around. Cross my heart and hope to die. Stick a needle in your eye.
One important point to make here is the fact that this machine operates while the user is still conscious, and if we were speaking strictly mechanically, it would be a lot simpler to perform this operation if the user was sedated. Based on what we've seen so far, it's not hard to believe that this operation has to be performed while the user is conscious in order for the intended effects to manifest. Even then, some sort of depressant pharmaceutical supplement could perhaps be used to at least slow down the patient's eye motions. Lastly, it's also not entirely clear whether or not this machine is autonomous or whether or not the patient inside it also has to be the one performing the operation. While an automated system could perhaps be better at tracking the patient's eye movements, the patient being the one pushing the button would at least have the benefit of them knowing which direction their eye is pointing at any given point in time. Either way, though, neither of these options really sounds like an optimal solution.
Nicole! Where are you?
As we're approaching the end of the game, we only have 2 chapters left, and both of them are quite short. This one is also complicated by a chase sequence that takes place for the first part of the chapter, so my inspection in that part was a bit rushed. Of course, there's nothing quite like the threat of imminent death by mutilation to help you focus on your engineering tasks. At least that's the theory we'll go with here. Now, regarding the marker's function to generate a convergence event, while we do eventually find out what the ultimate goal of convergence is in the sequel, the actual mechanism behind it and how it can be accomplished with an artificial object is probably beyond the realm of modern science. But to avoid spoiling things too much, we'll have to save this discussion for another time. However, based on the massive cooling network beneath the marker chamber, we can infer that a large amount of thermal energy is released during the convergence event. In keeping with the marker's characterization as a seemingly unlimited source of electromagnetic energy, this could perhaps have been an attempt at extracting some of this energy from the marker while it was still dormant. Alternatively, this release of energy could perhaps be part of the catalyst for the convergence event to start, and if the research team was aware of this, they could perhaps have built this heat transfer system in an attempt to prevent or forestall a convergence event. While the first of the cylindrical machines we come across in the cooling vents does seem to resemble a heat exchanger of some kind, with the numerous pipes surrounding a large central chamber, which also happens to have an access ladder over it for when the gravity is disabled, the second piston-type machine that we see appears to be designed primarily in reference to the eye poke machine that we just suffered through. It's also unclear whether or not this machine is leaking some sort of oil through its central puncture point, or if perhaps this is related to its operation in some way, since it seems to be exuding this jet in a rather controlled manner. Also within this cooling chamber, we can come across a number of fixtures on the walls that seem particularly familiar. These implements strongly resemble the grapple fixtures used on the International Space Station, as a standard interface on space station modules and visiting vehicles that allows its robotic arms to manipulate them. With such an uncanny resemblance, if this thing is supposed to be an actual grapple fixture, it has absolutely no reason to be within this cooling system. The only thing that could possibly make sense here is if there's some sort of robotic system that can be installed into this location to perform maintenance on these machines. But considering the fact that we haven't seen any of these grapple fixtures or really much of any sort of robotic system in this game so far, this is probably pretty unlikely. And finally, the last machines within this chamber resemble some sort of plasma discharge units that, based on the biohazard symbols on the towers, are perhaps used to purge off any biological matter that has somehow found its way into the system. The presence of these plasma channels, though, brings up another interesting point about this entire chamber as a whole, in that upon entering the chamber, the entire room is depressurized very quickly, which seems pretty difficult to do on its own, but also this would eliminate the capacity for convective heat transfer away from any of the systems within the chamber, thus making it less effective as a method of dissipating heat from the marker. Just before the final marker access checkpoint, there's a length of corridor marked as radiation containment. The walls seem to be lined with some sort of protective shielding, presumably some of the shielding mentioned earlier that attempts to block the marker's dementia signal. And from the pressurized gas systems in this area, we can suppose this is perhaps also using a hydrogen layer to provide additional shielding from conventional radiation sources, since hydrogen can actually function as a pretty effective radiation shield, if you can get it built up into a thick enough layer, that is. And here in this room, if you play video games long enough, you'll know to recognize a boss staging area when you see one. And so we've effectively concluded chapter 14, and we'll move on to the final chapter next.
This is it, Isaac. Convergence is almost here. Meet me at the marker.
Well, here we are at the end, the final chapter and the final approach to the marker itself. This circuitous path on the final approach snakes along massive ducts, and on some of the elevated walkways we can see manifolds that have symbols indicating radioactivity, biological hazards, and a third that's possibly water. Several holding tanks can be seen at the outer perimeter of this room that appear to bear similar symbols. And at the end of this pathway we can see some sort of intake that appears to be absorbing energy from the marker in some form. The simplest explanation could be that this system is intaking air from around the marker for processing and dividing it up into constituent substances. But at this stage of the game, it seems not unlikely that we have surpassed the boundaries of science and are now dealing with something beyond the realm of physics. Just before the end, we find a transmission from Director Tiedemann, recording after all is said and done that he did what he did because there was no choice. The promise of unlimited resources as a result of planet cracking fell short of what was required to keep humanity alive as they continued to spread throughout the stars. EarthGov believed the markers offered a salvation from the energy crisis, and perhaps even from entropy itself, but in the end, as we learn now, there never was any hope to begin with. And the exhausted interstellar civilization of humanity is now doomed to collapse into a dead space. And so with that, I really don't want to spoil the final confrontation if you somehow haven't played this masterpiece just yet. And in any case, there's not really much of a direct, obvious connection between this final confrontation and the destruction of the marker. Instead, I'll just show the lateral geniculate nucleus one more time, for some reason, and play out the final cutscene to conclude this chapter and the game. And so we have survived reviewing Dead Space 2. As was the case with the original, or at least the remake, the developers did a great job here at creating a world that feels authentic, and for the most part is actually quite accurate to space engineering principles, even down to some of the smaller details at times. Of course, there are occasional small things that don't always make perfect sense, but again, we are operating in a science fiction setting, and so I think whatever leeway we could afford to give the developers is more than enough to cover some of these smaller errors. In addition to the high degree of realism from a technical aspect, I would also mention that I really appreciate the way this story is written as well. While we could perhaps say occasionally that there are bits of filler here and there, it all feels like a natural progression from one chapter to the next. I'll also mention I really appreciate the way the characters are written in this game as well. Especially in Isaac's case, but also for Ellie, this isn't the first time they've had to deal with such a horrible situation.
Isaac, they're swarming into the ship!
And the focus of the plot shifts accordingly, away from purely survival to finding a way to stop the madness. And after every seemingly insurmountable roadblock that falls into their path, they find another thing to try, another possible solution to attempt, another way to keep going in spite of the looming threat of imminent death. And so, to conclude this review, there's a line from The Martian that I think best summarizes this entire story. At some point, everything's going to go south on you. Everything's going to go south and you're going to say, this is it. This is how I end. Now you can either accept that or you can get to work. Now there's just a couple quick housekeeping things I have to mention before closing out the video. Firstly, thank you so much for watching this far. I'm amazed that anybody's watching these extremely long videos that I'm making, let alone the many thousands of individual viewers that YouTube is showing me. And somehow more people were watching these videos than there were people in the city of Fargo, North Dakota. So I'm very thankful for all the support. And if you like this video and want to check out any more of my work, there's several games and plenty more hours to choose from. On that note, I am interested in doing more of these reviews, but as you can imagine, they take a ton of effort and time to actually complete. So in the meantime, I have a few other space and engineering related projects that I'll probably end up sharing on this channel. So if that sounds interesting, feel free to subscribe so you'll be notified next time I have a project or a review up and ready to go. And the last thing I have to say is if anybody at EA or Visceral is watching, thank you very much for making this game in the first place, and I really hope there's a way you can reconsider remaking this game. I might be a little disappointed having to redo the review, but I think I'd get over it. We really just don't get games that are presented or written as well as Dead Space 2 anymore. And so on that final note, I will end with what I think is the best example of just how awesome this game's story is.
Peter Phelps, Research Log 43553. I'm convinced we're puppets of some alien influence. I no longer believe we're in control of this project, or ever were. I believe even our rationalizations for this whole thing are an illusion, planted by the forces behind the original marker, the black one. We don't know how to make this thing. It is making us make it, and it's trying to get out, desperately. I'm under security watch after taking a sledgehammer to the tiny marker I built last week. We need to destroy everything we've built here, and destroy every record, every shred of research. They were right the first time on Aegis 7. This is beyond our ability to know or control. I have to go. My supervisor is whispering to the security guard.